I remember the year clearly because I had just turned 31, and I felt like I needed time away from everything. Life in the city was making me restless. I worked long hours, lived in a noisy apartment, and rarely felt calm. I kept telling myself that I needed to take a break before I burned myself out completely. That was when I found the small cabin online. It sat on the edge of a state forest, about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. It looked simple in the photos, a square wooden place with a deck that faced tall pine trees, nothing fancy. The listing said it had no Wi-Fi, no phone service, and no neighbors for miles. That was what caught my attention. I thought silence and space would be good for me. The drive out there was long, with most of the road twisting through forest that seemed endless. The closer I got, the more the traffic disappeared. By the time I reached the final dirt road that led to the cabin, I hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour. The road was narrow, with branches hanging over and brushing against my car as I crawled forward. The GPS on my phone had stopped working half an hour earlier, and all I had was a printed map the cabin owner had emailed me. I had to keep stopping to check it. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt both relief and unease. It looked the same as the photos, but standing there in person, it felt much more isolated than I had imagined. I parked in a small dirt clearing and carried my bags up onto the deck. The silence was heavy, only broken by the occasional bird or the sound of branches creaking in the wind. The cabin was one large open room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchen, and a wood stove. There was a bathroom in the back with an old shower and toilet. The inside smelled of wood and dust. I opened a few windows to let air in and unpacked my things. I had brought food that didn't need refrigeration since the cabin only had a small cooler with ice. I stacked my supplies neatly and then sat on the deck, looking out into the forest. The trees were thick, dark green, and seemed to go on forever. I didn't see a single sign of another person. For a while, I enjoyed that feeling, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how quickly unease replaced calm. It was strange to be somewhere so completely cut off. I didn't even have enough signal to send a text. That first night, I made a small fire in the stove, ate a sandwich, and read a book under the dim light of a lantern. The woods outside grew black fast, much darker than the city night sky. When I finally lay in bed, the quiet pressed against me. Every sound from outside seemed sharp and close. I heard owls, the creak of the cabin settling, and what sounded like branches snapping somewhere deep in the forest. I kept telling myself it was just animals. Deer maybe? But I had trouble falling asleep. I must have dozed off around midnight. I woke up hours later, not sure why at first. Then I realized I had heard something outside. It was faint, like the crunch of footsteps on the dirt clearing. I stayed completely still, listening hard. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I waited, heart racing, straining my ears, but nothing followed. I finally told myself it was probably just an animal wandering near the cabin. Still, I lay awake for a long time before drifting off again. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the clearing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I noticed marks that looked like shoe prints near where I had parked. They weren't clear enough to make out the tread, but they didn't look like deer tracks or any animal. I stared at them longer than I needed to, trying to convince myself they were old. Maybe from the cabin owner or a maintenance worker. But I couldn't shake the thought that they hadn't been there when I arrived. I went back inside and made coffee, trying to calm myself down. The day passed slowly. I walked a short way into the forest, but the trees were so thick that I turned back after only half a mile. Felt too easy to get lost without a trail. Back at the cabin, I spent hours reading, eating, and sitting on the deck. I thought I'd feel relaxed, but the isolation made every little sound feel amplified. When the wind moved through the trees, it sounded like whispers. When something rustled in the underbrush, I couldn't help but picture someone hiding out there. That night, the noises returned. I woke again to the sound of movement outside. This time it was clearer, heavier than the night before, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. My body froze. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, barely breathing. The steps circled to the back of the cabin, then silence. I wanted to get up and look out a window, but I was terrified of what I might see. I lay there, rigid, for what felt like hours before I finally drifted back to uneasy sleep. In the morning, I forced myself to check outside again. There were more prints, this time closer to the deck. They looked fresh. I crouched down to study them, and there was no mistaking it now, they were definitely shoe prints. Someone had been walking around the cabin at night. My stomach tightened. I stood there in the clearing, looking out at the endless trees, feeling completely exposed. There was no one to call, no cell signal. The nearest town was almost an hour's drive away. I debated packing up and leaving immediately, but a stubborn part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe hunters had wandered through. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to stay but kept myself busy. I chopped wood from the small pile near the cabin and carried it inside, even though I didn't really need it yet. I kept glancing into the trees, sure I would see someone standing there, but I never did. That night, I locked the cabin door and pushed a chair under the handle. I kept the lantern on low and lay awake for a long time, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the creak of the deck boards outside. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The steps were slow, deliberate, right outside the front door. Then silence. I held my breath, staring at the faint light on the ceiling from the lantern. For nearly an hour, I didn't hear another sound. Finally, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke at dawn, I checked the deck. Muddy shoe prints trailed across the boards, stopping right at the front door. My stomach dropped. Someone had stood there, only a thin wall away from me as I lay in bed. I packed my bag quickly, ready to leave, but when I got to my car, I froze. The tires were slashed, deep cuts across the rubber, both front and back. I stood there, staring at the ruined tires, the forest pressing close on all sides. Someone wanted me stuck here. I spent the day pacing, unable to think clearly. I searched the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon and found only a rusted hatchet near the woodpile. I kept it with me everywhere I went. I thought about walking back down the dirt road, but it stretched for miles before it hit the main highway, and the thought of being out there, exposed with someone following me, was worse than staying inside. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. Around midnight, I heard the back door rattle softly, like someone was testing it. I gripped the hatchet in my hand, sitting up in bed, staring into the dark. The rattling stopped. Then I heard footsteps circling again, slow, careful. Hours passed before silence returned. The next morning, I checked the back door. Scratches marked the wood near the handle, fresh and jagged. They hadn't managed to break in, but they were trying. I knew then that I couldn't spend another night here. I stuffed my bag with food, water, and the hatchet, and I left the cabin on foot. The dirt road stretched out in front of me, empty and silent. I walked fast, heart hammering, glancing over my shoulder constantly. The forest seemed alive with movement, but every time I turned, I saw nothing. I must have walked for nearly 3 hours before I saw the faint glimmer of pavement ahead. Relief surged through me, but then I froze. In the dirt at the edge of the road were fresh shoe prints, the same as the ones around the cabin. They led from the trees to the road, right where I was about to step out. Whoever it was, they had been watching, waiting. I forced myself forward anyway, out onto the asphalt, and kept walking. After another hour, a car finally passed, and I flagged it down. The driver looked at me with shock when I told him I had been stranded. He gave me a ride into town where I called for help. Later, when I returned with a tow truck to collect my car, the cabin looked the same as before, quiet and empty. But the footprints were still there, circling the cabin, leading into the trees. No one ever found out who it was. The police searched but told me they had no leads. I never went back. For months afterward, I had nightmares of standing on that deck, hearing footsteps outside, waiting for the door to break open. Even now, when I think of the silence of those woods, I don't feel peace. I feel watched. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was small, sitting back in the woods about 20 miles outside of town, tucked behind tall pines and thick brush. The man who rented it to me had told me it was old but sturdy, good for someone who wanted peace and quiet. At the time, that was exactly what I thought I needed. I had been working nonstop for months, dealing with the noise and rush of people every day, and I felt like I couldn't think anymore. So when I heard about the cabin being available, I thought it sounded perfect. The drive there was long. The dirt road twisted through the trees, full of ruts and holes that rattled the old truck I borrowed from my brother. I had packed food, water, and supplies to last me for at least a week, maybe more. I wanted to be away from everything. When I finally pulled up and parked in front of it, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No traffic, no people, not even planes overhead. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden porch as I stepped onto it. The cabin itself was plain. One floor, one bedroom, a bathroom, and a small living room with a wood stove in the corner. The air inside smelled musty, like damp wood, but it wasn't terrible. I set my bags down and walked through each room, checking the windows and doors, getting a feel for the place. There were no neighbors in sight. The closest house was probably miles away. It was exactly what I wanted. The first night was calm. I cooked some simple food, sat in a chair with a lantern, and listened to the quiet. At first, the silence felt comforting, like a heavy blanket around me. But as the night went on, it began to feel different. Every sound stood out. The cracking of wood as the cabin settled, the rustle of leaves outside, the thump of something small moving across the roof. I reminded myself it was just animals. Mice, maybe raccoons, or even a squirrel. Nothing unusual. Still, when I finally went to bed, it took a long time for me to fall asleep. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a trail behind it that wound deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, noticing how thick the trees were. The sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. I didn't see any people, no signs of hunters or hikers, not even trash left behind. It felt untouched. That made me feel safer at first, like I had the place completely to myself. But there was also something unsettling about being so far from anyone else. If something went wrong, it would take hours for help to come. I spent the day gathering firewood, fishing in a small stream nearby, and cleaning up inside the cabin. That night, I built a fire in the stove and felt more relaxed. The heat filled the small room, and I stretched out on the couch, drifting into sleep. Sometime in the night, though, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It was heavier, slower, like footsteps. I held my breath and listened. The sound moved around the cabin, crunching on the dry leaves. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a bear. The woods were full of them, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded steady, like a person walking. I lay still, waiting, listening to the steps move from one side of the cabin to the other. They stopped near the porch. I heard the wooden boards creak, the same way they had when I first arrived. My chest tightened, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark. The door was locked, but the cabin was old, and the lock was nothing strong. I waited, my ears straining. After a while, the sound stopped. I didn't hear the steps leave, but eventually, everything went quiet again. The next morning, I walked outside, looking for signs of what I heard. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so it was hard to see tracks. But near the porch, I noticed something strange. Some of the leaves had been brushed aside, like someone had dragged their foot or stood there for a while. I tried to convince myself it could have been an animal, but the shape looked more like a boot print than a paw. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I kept busy, chopping more wood, checking my supplies, and making sure the doors and windows were secure. The sense of being watched stayed with me, though. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the woods were empty. The nights were the worst. The third night, I woke again to the sound of movement outside. This time it was slower, as if someone was circling the cabin. I sat up in bed and grabbed the small hatchet I kept nearby. My mouth was dry, my hands sweating. I wanted to open the curtain and look out the window, but I was afraid of what I might see. I sat there, listening to the steps moving around and then stopping again near the porch. I hardly slept at all that night. When the morning came, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself to go outside again. I searched the ground more carefully this time. I found what looked like more prints, faint but there. They were longer than my own shoes and pressed deeper into the dirt near the side of the cabin. Someone had been there. Someone had walked around the cabin at night. I felt sick when I realized it wasn't my imagination. I thought about leaving, but the road was long, and part of me didn't want to feel like I was running. I told myself it could have been hunters passing through, maybe even someone lost in the woods. I kept repeating that to myself, but deep down, I didn't believe it. By the fourth day, I was on edge constantly. Every sound outside made me freeze. I barely ate, and I carried the hatchet with me even inside the cabin. That night, I decided to stay awake as long as I could. I sat in the chair by the window, the lantern turned off, just watching the dark. Hours passed, and my eyes grew heavy, but then I heard it again. The steps, slow, steady, circling the cabin. This time I forced myself to look. I moved the curtain just slightly and peered out into the trees. For a moment, I didn't see anything. Then, between the shadows, I caught a shape. Tall, thin, standing still among the trees, facing the cabin. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I froze, holding the curtain, afraid to move. The figure didn't come closer, just stood there, almost blending in with the trees. After a long time, I couldn't see it anymore. Either it had walked away silently, or I had lost it in the shadows. I shut the curtain and sat back, shaking. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They had been watching me for days. The thought of packing up and walking to the truck in the dark was unbearable, though, so I waited until morning. When daylight came, I rushed to gather my things. I loaded everything into the truck as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The woods were silent again, but the silence felt different now, heavier. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, my hands tight on the wheel. The drive out felt endless. Every turn of the road, I expected to see someone step out of the trees, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I told the man I was done with it and left it behind. But even now, when I think about it, I can still picture the figure standing among the trees at night, watching. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know I wasn't imagining it. The footprints were real. The sounds were real. Someone had been out there waiting in the dark. That was the end of my time in the cabin, and I've never gone that deep into the woods alone again. I never thought I would spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, but life pushed me in that direction. I had been working nonstop for months, barely sleeping, always feeling drained. I wanted a break from the noise, from the screens, from the endless cycle of work and pressure. A friend of mine told me about an old cabin he used a couple of summers back. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even meant for vacations in the traditional sense. It was more like a hunting cabin. A small wooden place built decades ago, left half forgotten, sitting at the edge of a lake surrounded by endless trees. The idea stuck in my mind. Solitude, silence, space to breathe. That was all I wanted. I packed my bags with simple things. Some clothes, a flashlight, a knife, a camping stove, canned food, dry goods, matches, and a few personal items. I didn't want to depend on electricity, and from what I was told, the cabin didn't even have running water. So I carried bottles and a large jug filled with fresh water. I made sure to bring a sleeping bag since the beds there were supposed to be old and uncomfortable. I wanted to make the place livable for at least a week. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning and drove for hours until paved roads turned into gravel, and gravel turned into dirt paths. My car bumped and rattled as I followed the path deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser. My phone signal disappeared. I felt both uneasy and free. By the time I reached the narrow clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already dipping low, spilling orange light across the lake. The cabin itself looked old but solid. Wooden planks, weathered and gray, formed the structure. The roof sagged slightly on one side, but it was intact. A small porch stretched across the front with a single chair sitting on it, tilted, as if someone had once left it there and never returned. The windows were dusty. The door had a heavy latch. When I unlocked it and pushed it open, a smell of damp wood and dust hit me. Inside, it was simple. One large room with a small wood stove in the corner, a rickety wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed frame against the far wall with a thin mattress that looked as though no one had slept on it in years. Cobwebs clung to the corners. A layer of dust covered most surfaces. The place had clearly been sitting untouched for some time. Still, it felt safe enough. I swept the floor, wiped down the table, and set up my sleeping bag on the bed. By the time I settled in, the sun was gone and the forest outside was alive with sound. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the night. I lit a lantern and sat at the table, eating from a can of beans while listening to the wilderness outside. I told myself this was what I needed. Quiet, space, no people, no screens, just me and the forest. The first night passed without much trouble. I woke up a few times because of the strange noises outside, the groan of wood as the cabin adjusted to the cooling night, or the distant sound of branches snapping. But nothing bothered me directly. By morning, I felt rested. I made coffee on the camping stove and drank it on the porch while looking at the still water of the lake. A thin mist hovered above it, shifting slowly in the cool air. I decided to explore the area. I followed a narrow trail along the shoreline, stepping over roots and fallen branches. The forest felt endless. Pines stretched high above me, their tops swaying with the breeze. I walked for about an hour before turning back. It was easy to lose track of direction in those woods, and I didn't want to risk it. Back at the cabin, I made myself some food and spent the afternoon reading a book I brought. That was the rhythm I expected to keep. Simple days, quiet nights, just me and the woods. But things started to feel different on the second night. It was late, maybe close to midnight. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the usual sounds outside, when I heard something that didn't fit. It wasn't the sound of an animal scurrying or the distant call of a bird. It was heavier, a slow crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, faint but deliberate. I froze, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the dying lantern. My heart beat fast. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer wandering close, maybe curious about the cabin. But deep down, it didn't sound like that. The weight in the steps felt different. I waited in silence for a long time. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then near the back corner, I spotted it. A boot print pressed into the dirt. Clear, deep, unmistakably human. My chest tightened. No one was supposed to be out here. The nearest town was miles away. I hadn't passed another vehicle on the road in. It didn't make sense. I tried to brush it off. Maybe an old print. Maybe someone had come through weeks or months ago, a hunter or hiker. But the edges of the print looked sharp, fresh. I told myself not to think about it too much. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't wander far. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. When night came, I secured the latch on the door and pushed the table against it. I sat up for hours listening. The forest was alive again with its natural sounds, but beneath it, I kept waiting for something else. And eventually, I heard it again. This time, the steps came from the side of the cabin, slow, deliberate. They stopped directly outside the wall near the bed. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they were standing just feet from me, separated only by a thin wooden wall. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My mind raced with questions. Why were they there? What did they want? Minutes passed. The sound of breathing reached me. Slow, faint, but there. Someone was standing outside in the dark, listening, just as I was. My hands shook. I reached slowly for the knife I kept near the bed. The breathing continued for what felt like forever, and then it faded. The steps moved away into the forest until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I felt drained, running on nerves and fear. I went outside carefully, scanning the treeline. Nothing, but the ground told another story. More prints, fresh, leading from the forest right up to the side of the cabin, then back again. My stomach turned. This wasn't random. Someone was deliberately coming here at night. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to town. But part of me resisted. I had come here for peace, to prove to myself I could handle being alone. I didn't want to run after only 2 nights, so I stayed. But from that point on, everything changed. The days were quiet, but not peaceful anymore. Every rustle in the woods, every shadow between the trees, made me jump. I started checking the cabin constantly, making sure the latch was shut, making sure nothing was disturbed. I barely ate. I barely slept. At night, I sat in the dark with the lantern turned low, holding the knife, listening. On the 4th night, something new happened. The sound of footsteps came again, but this time there was no hesitation. Whoever it was walked right up onto the porch. The boards creaked under their weight. I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, clutching the knife so tightly my hand hurt. The steps stopped just outside the door. Then, slowly, the latch rattled. Someone was testing it. My whole body went cold. I pushed myself up silently, heart pounding, and braced against the door. The table was still there, pressed against it. The latch rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. Silence followed. I strained to hear anything. Then I caught the faint crunch of steps moving away, back into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my bag quickly, stuffing everything inside without care. I took the knife, the flashlight, the water. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp and cool. The forest was still, too still. I made my way to the car, parked a short distance away along the dirt path. But when I reached it, my heart dropped. The tires were slashed, all 4 of them. The rubber was torn open, flat against the ground. My escape was gone. Panic gripped me. I looked around, but the forest was empty. The silence pressed down on me. I forced myself to think. Walking was the only option. The road out was long, but if I followed it, I could reach the main road by late evening, maybe flag someone down. I strapped on my bag and started walking. The road stretched ahead, winding through the trees. Every step felt heavier. I kept glancing behind me, convinced someone was following. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry. Still, I kept moving. At one point, I heard it again. Footsteps, faint, behind me. I turned quickly. I had been needing a break from everything for a while. Work had been grinding me down. My phone never seemed to stop buzzing, and the city felt like it was pressing in on me from every direction. I wanted quiet, space, and air that didn't smell like car exhaust. I didn't want a hotel or a resort. I wanted to be alone, far away from crowds and noise. That's what led me to the cabin. It wasn't some luxury vacation rental with polished wood and hot tubs. This place was old, small, and plain. A friend of mine had mentioned once that his uncle owned a piece of property out by a lake in the middle of nowhere, and that there was a cabin on it no one really used anymore. I got the directions, packed up some food, water, and gear, and made the drive out. It took me nearly 4 hours to get there, with the last hour being nothing but narrow dirt roads cutting through thick woods. By the time I pulled up, I was already thinking about how isolated it was. The trees pressed in on all sides, tall pines blocking most of the sunlight. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, its wooden boards gray from years of weather. The windows were simple panes of glass with no curtains, and the front porch sagged just slightly. It was the kind of place most people would probably call creepy. For me, at first, it was exactly what I wanted, quiet and empty. Inside, it was just as simple. One main room with a wood stove, a rough wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, and a small cot in the corner. There was no running water, no electricity, and no cell service. I knew that before I came, and I thought I was fine with it. I had brought lanterns, batteries, a small camping stove, and a cooler full of food. I figured I could last a week out there without a problem. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my things, checked the place over for leaks or damage, and set up my cooler and supplies. The lake was only a short walk through the trees, so I went down there for a while, sitting on the bank and letting myself breathe for what felt like the first time in months. It was still. No boats, no people, just the water lapping gently against the shore and the occasional bird overhead. That night, when the sun went down, the silence became heavier. The woods were pitch black, darker than anything I was used to, and when I blew out the lantern before bed, the cabin was swallowed in darkness. Lying there, I listened to the creaks of the old boards, the faint sounds of wind in the trees, and the occasional crack of a branch outside. It should have been peaceful, but my body didn't relax the way I thought it would. Every noise made me more alert. I told myself it was just the adjustment of being so far from the city. The second day, I started to feel the isolation more. I walked further into the woods, following faint animal trails, and kept circling back to make sure I didn't get lost. It struck me how easy it would be for someone to vanish out there and never be found. No one would hear if I called for help. No one would even know if I was in trouble. That thought stuck with me longer than I wanted it to. That night, lying in bed again, I heard something different. It wasn't just branches or wind. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps in the leaves outside the cabin. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't 4 quick legs, it was 2. 2 feet moving carefully around the cabin. My chest tightened as I lay completely still, straining my ears. The steps circled the cabin slowly, crunching the leaves and then stopping. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I stayed frozen, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, I heard the steps moving away into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My mind kept racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, or some hiker who got turned around. But the way the steps circled, slow and careful, felt intentional, like someone was checking the cabin. The next morning, I went outside and looked for prints. The ground around the cabin was covered with leaves, but in a few places where the dirt was exposed, I saw them, shoe prints. Not boots like a hunter might wear, but regular sneakers. They weren't mine. They were fresh, the edges sharp in the soil. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, my stomach sinking. Whoever it was, they had been right up against the cabin in the middle of the night, watching. I told myself I should pack up and leave, but part of me resisted. I had driven all the way out there for peace and quiet, and I didn't want to scare myself into running off after only 2 days. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was probably nothing. Maybe just some local kid messing around. During the day, I felt a little calmer. I went back to the lake, cooked a simple meal, and tried to relax. But as soon as the sun started dropping, dread set in. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat with the lantern burning until I couldn't keep my eyes open. That night, the footsteps came again. Slower this time, closer. I heard the faint scrape of something against the wall, like fingers or a stick being dragged along the wooden boards. Then silence. I stayed rigid in my cot, barely breathing. Hours seemed to crawl by before I finally drifted off in exhaustion. When I woke up the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the window nearest the cot, smeared into the dust on the glass, was the faint outline of a handprint. Someone had pressed their hand flat against the window while I was sleeping a few feet away. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They were watching me. The problem was I was stuck. I had come in on narrow dirt roads, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. If I tried to leave and something happened to the car, I'd be stranded in the woods. I decided to hold out one more night and leave first thing in the morning. That day was the longest of my life. I barely ate. I kept pacing the cabin, looking out the windows, listening for any sound in the woods. Every little noise made me jump. When night fell, I didn't blow out the lantern. I sat there fully dressed, my bag packed, my flashlight in my hand. Hours dragged on, the silence pressing down like a weight. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, But this time, they didn't circle. They came straight to the door. The handle rattled. Slow, testing turns, like someone was checking to see if it was locked. My mouth went dry, and my heart hammered in my chest. I held the flashlight like a weapon, staring at the door, waiting. The rattling stopped, and for a long time there was silence. Then I heard the faint creak of the porch boards as someone crouched down right outside. I didn't sleep at all. I sat there frozen until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally opened the door, whoever it was had gone. But on the porch, scratched lightly into the wood, were 3 short lines. Not words, just marks, like someone had taken a knife and carved them while crouched there in the dark. That was it for me. I grabbed my bag, tossed everything else into the car, and drove out of there as fast as the road would let me. Every twist and turn in the dirt path, I kept expecting to see someone step out in front of me, but I never did. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there shaking, trying to calm down. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footprints, the handprint, the scratches, they were real. Someone had been out there, watching me, circling me, coming closer each night. I never went back to that cabin. And even now, when I think about it, I don't wonder what it was. I know what it was. Someone, some stranger, saw that cabin and decided to stalk it. To stalk me, and I'll never know how close they came to walking through that door. I never thought spending a week in a cabin by myself would turn into the longest, most exhausting and frightening stretch of days I had ever lived through. I used to think of myself as someone who enjoyed quiet, open spaces. I liked long drives, I liked being alone, and I liked the way nature could strip things down to the basics. That was part of the reason I booked a remote cabin in the first place. I thought a week out there would clear my head. What I didn't understand was how quickly comfort could turn into unease, and unease into something much worse when I realized how cut off I really was. The cabin was in northern Montana, tucked far off a logging road that had been half abandoned for years. I booked it through a small listing I found online. The owner promised quiet, privacy, and plenty of space. The photos showed a simple structure: wooden walls darkened with age, a metal roof that looked dented in places, and a narrow porch overlooking a slope of pine trees. The nearest town was almost an hour away. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. The drive out was longer than I expected. The paved road turned to gravel, then dirt, and the dirt narrowed until I felt like I was driving directly into the forest. My cell service dropped off about 30 minutes before I arrived. I remember staring at my phone, waiting for the signal bars to come back, but they never did. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up. The clearing around the cabin was smaller than the photos had made it seem. The trees stood close, tall and thick, leaning in as though they wanted to swallow the place whole. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean enough. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a main room with a wood stove and a sagging couch, and a bedroom at the back. There was no electricity besides a couple of solar-charged lights, and no plumbing besides a hand pump at the sink and an outhouse a few steps behind the cabin. I unpacked slowly, listening to the silence pressing in from the trees. At first, the silence was the point. I set up my food supplies, checked the locks, and started a fire in the stove. I kept telling myself that this was what I had been craving. Nothing but stillness. No cars, no voices, no constant buzzing from my phone. Just me and the woods. I cooked a simple meal and sat on the porch as the sky dimmed and the pines grew black against the horizon. The air smelled sharp, like sap and damp earth. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern light, turned in early, and slept fairly well. But when I stepped outside in the morning, I saw something that unsettled me. The ground around the outhouse showed fresh boot prints. They were clear, crisp impressions in the dirt, larger than mine and leading away into the trees. I stood staring at them, trying to convince myself they must have been left by the owner, maybe checking on the place before I arrived. But the edges of the prints were too sharp for that. They hadn't been rained on or wind-worn. They had been made recently. I told myself it didn't matter. Hunters, hikers, someone could have wandered close by. This was public land for miles around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the prints were too close to the cabin, as if whoever left them had been circling the spot where I slept. That day, I hiked a little, following a trail behind the cabin. The forest was thick, with ground covered in needles and fallen branches that crunched underfoot. Sunlight came through in patches, never enough to light the ground fully. I tried to enjoy it, tried to focus on the stillness, but every time I looked down, I thought of those boot prints by the outhouse. By the second night, I had become hyper-aware of sounds. The forest was not silent at all. It was full of creaks, snaps, rustles. I told myself it was animals, deer, raccoons, maybe even bears. But each time I heard a branch break, I pictured someone walking just beyond the reach of the lantern light. That night, I barely slept. I woke again and again, sure I had heard something moving outside the cabin. On the third day, I decided to check the perimeter more carefully. I walked the clearing slowly, studying the dirt and pine needles for any sign of tracks. Near the edge of the trees behind the cabin, I found them again. More prints, heavy and deliberate. They were spaced far apart, as if the person had been striding quickly. My stomach turned cold. I considered leaving right then, but the thought of driving the long, rough road in the dark if I delayed even an hour made me hesitate. I tried to convince myself it was still nothing. Maybe hunters passing through, maybe kids exploring. I forced myself to chop wood, cook food, and act like everything was normal. That night, the noises came closer. I heard a crunch of leaves, then silence, then another crunch. I sat up in bed, listening, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would drown out the sounds. I stared at the window but saw only darkness. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the noises faded. I must have dozed, because when I opened my eyes again, the room was pale with morning light. By then, the unease had hardened into something sharper. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was coming near the cabin. Maybe not every night, but often enough. And they weren't stumbling by accident. They were walking directly around the clearing, watching. On the fourth day, I made a decision. I packed my bag, stuffed the food I could carry inside, and loaded it in my car. But when I turned the key, the engine only clicked. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I sat gripping the wheel, my breath fogging in the cold morning air. There was no signal, no way to call anyone. I told myself I could walk out. It would take hours, maybe all day, but it was possible. Still, the thought of leaving the cabin unguarded, with my things inside, made me hesitate again. I was trapped between bad options. Finally, I unpacked the car and carried everything back inside. If I had to walk out, I would do it tomorrow at first light. That night was the worst so far. I heard movement again, closer than ever. Footsteps circling slowly, crunching the ground just outside the walls. Then silence, as if the person had stopped to listen. I sat frozen on the bed, gripping a heavy flashlight in my hand. My mouth was dry, my body locked in place. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow flick across the window, but I couldn't be sure. Eventually, the footsteps retreated into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle aching. When daylight finally came, I stuffed what I could into a pack. Water, food, flashlight, map. I locked the cabin, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined. Then I started walking down the long dirt road. The forest seemed endless. The road twisted and dipped, vanishing into dark stretches of pines where the air felt heavy. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound, a squirrel darting through leaves, a branch snapping, felt like someone following. After hours, my legs were shaking and my throat was dry. The road seemed to stretch on forever. It was late afternoon when I realized I wasn't going to make it to town before dark. My stomach turned as I looked at the shadows lengthening across the road. I knew stopping out here would be even worse than the cabin. At least there I had walls and a door. Out here I would be exposed on all sides. I had no choice but to turn back. By the time I stumbled into the clearing again, the sun was nearly gone. My feet ached and my pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I pushed open the cabin door, dropped everything inside, and locked it tight. That night I heard nothing, but I also didn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of those boot prints over and over. The next morning, something had changed. I stepped outside and froze. The prints weren't just by the outhouse or the trees anymore. They were on the porch. Clear marks on the wooden boards leading up to the front door. My skin crawled. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the night, stood just feet away from where I was lying awake, and then turned back into the forest. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I would walk out again, no matter how long it took, but this time I wouldn't stop. I filled my pack, tightened the straps, and left the cabin behind. I walked for hours, refusing to look back. My legs trembled, my lips cracked, but I kept going. The road climbed, then dropped into valleys, then climbed again. I felt like I was trapped in some endless loop. The shadows grew longer and longer, the forest darker. My chest ached with panic. Then, just as the last light was fading, I saw headlights far in the distance. A truck bounced along the road, the sound of its engine breaking the silence. I staggered forward, waving both arms until the driver slowed and leaned out the window. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. The man gave me a ride into town. He asked questions, but I barely answered. My throat felt locked. All I could think of was the cabin sitting alone in the forest, the prints on the porch, and the silence of someone walking circles around the place at night. I never went back. The owner sent messages later, saying I had left food behind, asking if everything was fine. I never answered. I didn't care about the food or the pack or anything else. All I cared about was that I had gotten out. Even now, I still remember the first time I saw the cabin. It sat back from the gravel road, almost hidden behind tall pine trees that leaned in like they were trying to guard it from the outside world. The roof was dark green metal, streaked with rust near the edges. The wood siding had gone gray with age, and the front porch sagged just enough to make it look tired. It was quiet, with no sound except the wind moving through the trees. I had been looking for a place to get away from the city for a while. My work had been eating me alive, and I thought a week in the woods would clear my head. When I found the listing online, the photos showed a simple one-room cabin with a small loft for sleeping. It didn't look fancy, but it was cheap and far away from everything. That was all I wanted. I parked my car on the edge of the clearing and carried my bag up the porch steps. The boards creaked under my boots. I could smell damp wood and pine needles. When I opened the door, it let out a long groan like it hadn't been moved in years. Inside, the air was cool and musty. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the single window over the sink. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a ladder that led up to the loft. Everything looked old but sturdy. I set my bag on the table and walked around to take it in. The sink didn't have a faucet, just a metal basin that drained outside. There was no power, no cell service. A lantern and some half-burned candles sat on a shelf. Against the back wall, there was a narrow door that led to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet. That was it. It was simple, which was fine with me. The first day passed easily. I unpacked my food and supplies, swept the floor, and opened the small windows to let in fresh air. Later, I walked down a faint trail that started behind the cabin. It wound through the pines until it reached a small stream with clear, cold water. I knelt there and splashed my face, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. That night, I sat on the porch and listened to the woods. The sky turned dark, and stars filled it in a way I never saw back in the city. The only sounds were insects, the distant rush of the stream, and the occasional creak of trees shifting in the wind. It was quiet in a way that felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. When I finally climbed up into the loft and unrolled my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost right away. The second day was just as calm. I made a small fire in the stove to boil water for coffee. The air outside smelled sharp and fresh, and the sunlight came through the trees in bright beams. I spent the morning exploring farther down the trail, following the stream until it opened into a small pond surrounded by reeds. I sat there for a while, watching dragonflies skim the surface and listening to the splash of a fish jumping. But later, when I walked back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. The ground near the trail had fresh footprints. At first, I thought they might be mine from earlier, but they didn't match. They were larger, heavier. I crouched down and looked closer. The prints were clear in the soft dirt. Boots, not bare feet. Whoever it was had walked toward the cabin. I felt a flicker of unease, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone else hiked through the area. Maybe the cabin wasn't as remote as I thought. Still, when I came back into the clearing and saw the cabin sitting there in the sunlight, the air seemed different, heavier. I walked around the cabin and checked the doors and windows. Nothing looked disturbed. Everything was how I left it. That night, I couldn't relax the same way I had before. I kept thinking about the footprints. I sat on the porch longer than usual, listening harder to the woods. When I finally went inside, I slid the bolt across the door and leaned my pack against it. I climbed up into the loft and lay in my sleeping bag, staring into the dark. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. I woke up hours later to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, muffled. At first I thought it was wind against the walls, but then I heard it again, wood creaking, slow and careful. My eyes adjusted to the dim light from the moon coming through the window. I held still, straining to hear. Another creak, closer this time. It was the porch. My throat tightened. I lay frozen, barely breathing. Then came the softest sound, the door handle moving. Just a tiny click of metal. I gripped the edge of my sleeping bag, waiting for the door to swing open. But it didn't. The handle stilled, and silence returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, heart racing, ears straining. The noises never came again, but I didn't sleep. At dawn, I climbed down from the loft and carefully checked the door. The bolt was still in place, just how I left it, but the handle was turned all the way down. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. Someone had tried to open the door while I was inside. I forced myself to move. I stepped onto the porch and looked around the clearing. The dirt showed more boot prints right up to the door. I followed them a few steps, but they faded into the pine needles. Whoever it was, they'd been close. Too close. The rest of that day felt different. The woods no longer seemed calm. Every sound made me flinch. I stayed near the cabin, keeping my knife on my belt and checking over my shoulder. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the prints were real. The turned handle was real. By the time evening came, I knew I wouldn't sleep. I gathered my supplies and set them by the door so I could leave quickly if I needed to. I kept the lantern low and sat at the table, listening. Hours crawled by. Then, sometime deep into the night, it happened again. The porch creaked. This time I didn't freeze. I turned down the lantern, crouched low, and moved quietly to the window. The moonlight was just enough to see shapes outside. A figure stood on the porch. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was a man, tall, wearing a jacket and a hat pulled low. He was only a few feet away, right on the other side of the wall. I could hear the boards strain under his weight as he shifted. He reached for the handle again. The bolt held, but the door rattled softly as he tested it. My chest felt like it was going to burst. He stood there for what felt like forever, trying the handle, pressing lightly against the wood. Then he stopped. I thought maybe he'd leave, but instead, he turned and walked slowly around the cabin. I crept to the other window and saw him pass by, moving steady, head tilted toward the walls like he was listening. He circled the cabin, steps crunching in the dirt, boards creaking under his boots when he came back to the porch. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Hours passed before dawn finally came. When I opened the door that morning, the clearing looked empty, but the ground told the truth. Boot prints circled the cabin again and again, weaving close to the walls, pausing at the windows. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed everything fast, hands shaking, and loaded my car. My eyes kept darting to the trees, expecting to see him standing there, watching. But the woods stayed still. When I finally started the engine and rolled down the gravel road, I didn't look back. The cabin shrank behind me, hidden by the pines. The whole time I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a figure walking down the road. but nothing followed. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a gas station and sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself I was safe now, that I had left him behind. But even now, weeks later, when I close my eyes at night, I hear the sound of boots on the porch, slow and careful. I see the door handle turning, held down by a hand I never saw clearly. And I know he's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next cabin with a light in the window. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected, sitting at the edge of the pines with its weathered boards faded gray from years of sun and rain. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows looked like dark holes from a distance. It was the kind of place that didn't look inviting, but I had rented it for a week because it was cheap and out of the way. I thought the isolation would give me peace. The drive out there had taken almost 6 hours from my home. Most of the last hour was spent on a narrow gravel road that wound deeper into the forest. My phone had lost its signal a while before I reached the property, and the silence of the woods pressed in on me as I parked my car in front of the cabin. I carried my bags up the small steps, and when I pushed open the front door, the smell of old wood and dust hit me. The inside was simple: a single main room with a small kitchen in one corner, a couch and table in the center, and a wood stove against one wall. The bedroom was through a short hallway, and the bathroom was beside it. There was no television, no internet, no phone service. Only a battery-powered radio sat on the counter. First, I liked it. The quiet felt heavy but different from the constant noise of the city. I unpacked my things slowly, moving them into the drawers and onto the shelves. I swept the floor even though it didn't need much, opened the small windows to let in air, and sat for a while on the porch, listening to the forest. The tall pine trees swayed in the breeze, their needles whispering against each other. By late afternoon, I felt relaxed. I cooked some food on the small propane stove, cleaned up afterward, and watched the sun dip lower between the trees. As night came, I lit a lantern, set it on the table, and sat there with a book. Outside, the forest grew darker until the window glass reflected only the inside of the cabin. I couldn't see beyond my own dim reflection, and for some reason, that unsettled me. When I went to bed, the silence was complete. No cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of electricity I was used to. Just the faint creaking of the cabin settling and the occasional snap of branches outside. I slept lightly and woke several times, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling. The second day was easier. I walked along the trail behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, but it seemed used enough to follow. The trees grew close, and the air smelled damp and heavy with sap. I walked for hours, turning back only when I realized I hadn't brought water. When I got back, I was sweaty and thirsty, but the air felt cooler in the shade of the porch. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps on the gravel near the car. I sat up and listened hard, but after a long pause, it was quiet again. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The third day, I noticed something strange. In the dirt near the porch steps, I saw a footprint. It was human, not an animal. The tread of a shoe was clear, pressed into the soil. I crouched down and stared at it. It wasn't mine. I had been wearing heavy hiking boots, and this one looked like a lighter shoe. The print was fresh too, sharp around the edges. I looked around, scanning the trees, but everything was still. I told myself maybe it was left by someone before I arrived, though I hadn't seen anyone on the property. I brushed it over with my boot until it blended into the dirt, then went inside. That day, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside seemed louder, sharper. The creak of the trees, the tapping of branches, the crack of something moving in the undergrowth. I tried to read, but I kept looking up, staring at the windows. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt like it was holding something unseen. By evening, I decided to make sure the doors were locked. The front had a deadbolt, and the back door near the kitchen had a simple latch. I tested both twice before going to bed. I lay there for a long time, listening, Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of gravel. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't move, just listened as the sound came closer, then stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed, and nothing else happened. The next morning, I checked outside. The dirt near the steps was disturbed again. Another footprint. This one pointed toward the cabin. I felt a chill run down my back. Someone had been there right outside while I was inside. The rational part of me tried to make excuses. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe someone wandering through the woods. But the prints were too close. Whoever it was had come right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. I spent that day inside, keeping the curtains closed. I carried the heavy flashlight with me wherever I went. I set a chair under the door handle in the bedroom before I tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the back door rattling. Not once, but a soft shake like someone testing it. My whole body went cold. I held my breath and waited. The rattling stopped, and after what felt like an hour, I finally drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The next morning, I wanted to leave. I wanted to get into my car and drive away, but part of me felt stubborn. I told myself maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the wind had moved the door. Maybe I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I walked down the trail again that afternoon, trying to calm myself, but I didn't go far. I kept thinking someone was behind me, watching. Every time I turned around, the trail was empty. When I got back, I noticed something that froze me in place. On the porch railing, there was a mark, a scratch carved into the wood. It was small, but it hadn't been there before. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in the main room with the lantern burning low, staring at the doors. Hours passed, the shadows shifting on the walls. Around 3, I heard the crunch of gravel again. Slow, steady steps. They stopped just outside the front door. I didn't move. The lantern flickered, and the silence pressed in. Then came the sound of the doorknob turning. Slow, careful. My throat tightened. The deadbolt held. The knob rattled softly, then stopped. After a long time, the footsteps retreated into the forest. In the morning, I checked outside again. On the ground, clear in the dirt, were more footprints. They circled the cabin this time, going from door to door, window to window. Whoever it was had walked around the entire place while I sat inside. That was when I decided to leave. I packed my bags quickly, throwing everything into my duffel. I loaded the car, glanced one last time at the cabin, and got behind the wheel. When I turned the key, the engine didn't start. It made a weak clicking sound, then died. I tried again, but nothing. The battery was dead. Panic rose in my chest. The road back to town was miles of forest, too far to walk before dark. I checked my phone, still no signal. I sat there in the car, gripping the wheel, realizing I was stuck. I went back inside and locked the doors again. The rest of the day dragged on like a nightmare. Every noise outside made me jump. I barely ate. I kept looking at the windows, half expecting a face to appear. That night, the noises returned. Footsteps closer this time. A scrape against the wall. A tap on the window glass. I sat frozen in the chair, the lantern burning low. At one point, I heard breathing outside the bedroom window. Slow, steady breathing inches from the glass. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I was desperate. I decided I would walk out no matter how long it took. I stuffed my bag with water, some food, and the flashlight, and stepped onto the trail. My heart pounded with every step. I kept glancing back at the cabin, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but nothing moved. I walked for hours, following the gravel road. The forest pressed close, the trees leaning over like they wanted to block the sky. My legs ached, but I kept going. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, the road was empty. Finally, as the sun began to sink, I saw another road ahead, paved one. Relief washed through me, and I pushed myself faster until I reached it. Not long after, a passing truck came down the road. I waved it down and the driver stopped. He gave me a ride back into town. From there, I was able to call for help and arrange a tow for my car. When I told the mechanic about the battery, he said it hadn't been drained naturally. The wires had been cut. That was when everything made sense. The footsteps, the scratching, the rattling door. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there in the woods watching me, trying to get inside, and when I tried to leave, they made sure I couldn't. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, when I think about it, my skin crawls. Whoever was out there had been patient, circling me night after night, waiting for me to break. I'll never know what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to have walked away at all. I had been planning to take some time away from everything for a while. Life had started to feel crowded, like there was no space left for quiet. I had saved some money, and I found a small cabin listed on a rental site that seemed perfect. It was in the mountains, a long drive away from town, tucked back off a dirt road near a lake. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin with a small porch, one bedroom, a wood stove, and a view of trees in every direction. It wasn't fancy, but I wasn't looking for fancy. I just wanted silence, air that didn't smell like exhaust, and nights without traffic humming through thin apartment walls. I packed food that would last me the week, water jugs, a sleeping bag even though the cabin had a bed, and some books I had been meaning to read. I threw in a flashlight, extra batteries, and my hiking boots. I figured I would hike during the days and sit by the stove at night. That was all I wanted. The drive took almost 8 hours. By the time I turned onto the last gravel road, I felt stiff from sitting so long. The trees grew thicker the further I drove, their branches leaning over the road so that the sunlight only cut through in narrow strips. I passed no houses, no cars, no signs that anyone else lived nearby. When I finally reached the narrow turnoff for the cabin, the road was little more than 2 tracks of dirt with grass growing in the middle. I followed it slowly, my tires bumping over roots, until the cabin came into view. It looked smaller than in the photos, darker too, like the wood had soaked in years of rain. There was a stack of firewood on one side, covered by a blue tarp weighed down with rocks. The porch sagged a little, but the door looked sturdy. Behind the cabin, the trees crowded close, their trunks straight and tall. The silence was heavy. I shut the car off, and for a moment I just sat there, letting it sink in that I was completely alone. I unloaded my bags and set them inside. The interior smelled of wood and dust, the kind of smell that sticks to cabins left closed for too long. The single window above the sink was streaked with dirt, and when I pushed it open, it creaked loud enough that the sound seemed to echo. The only other window was in the bedroom, looking out toward the trees. There was no electricity. A couple of old oil lamps sat on the counter, half-filled. The stove was black with soot but solid. I spent the first hour settling in, sweeping out cobwebs, airing the place out, stacking some wood inside by the stove. I ate a quick meal from a cooler and sat on the porch with a bottle of water. The woods pressed in close. No cars, no voices, no sound except the occasional bird call. It felt like I had been dropped into a different world. That first night was uneventful. I lit the stove and read by lantern until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The bed was hard, but it didn't matter. I fell asleep quickly. The second day, I woke early, walked down to the lake, and followed the shoreline for a while. The air was colder near the water, and fog drifted across the surface until the sun burned it away. I saw deer tracks in the mud and the scat of some animal I couldn't identify. I spent hours hiking trails that weren't marked, just faint paths through the trees. Every time I stopped walking, the silence closed in again. I realized how unused I was to true quiet. It was later that afternoon, on my way back, that I thought I heard something behind me, just a faint crunch like a footstep. I stopped and turned, but the trail was empty. I waited, listening, but nothing came. I shook it off as a squirrel or a branch falling. Still, I walked a little quicker the rest of the way. Back at the cabin, I cooked dinner on the stove, simple food, and sat outside to eat. The woods felt darker that evening, as if the trees had grown closer. I reminded myself that isolation can make your mind play tricks. Every sound seems sharper when you're alone. That night, I slept poorly. I woke up several times, sure that I had heard something outside the cabin. Once it was a scraping sound near the porch, another time it was what I thought might be a knock, though it could have been a branch in the wind. I got up, checked the door, and even stepped out with my flashlight. The light beam cut through the dark and landed on trees, nothing else. My chest felt tight, but I told myself it was just the natural sounds of a forest at night. On the third day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I collected more firewood, tidied the interior, and spent hours reading. The day passed slowly, but as evening came, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Every so often I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shift of shadow, a flash of something pale. Each time I stared hard, it vanished. I started keeping the lanterns closer. I left one burning low on the table even when I lay down to sleep. That night, just as I was drifting off, I heard the porch creak. My heart jumped. I held my breath, listening. There was another creak, softer, like weight shifting. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but after a few moments it went silent. I didn't sleep much after that. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I hadn't seen another person since arriving, but I couldn't shake the idea that someone had followed me here. I walked the perimeter of the cabin that morning, looking for tracks. Near the back corner, I found what looked like the imprint of a boot in the dirt. It was faint, but it wasn't mine. I crouched down, running my hand over it, and felt a cold wave rush through me. I had been telling myself I was imagining things, but that print was real. The rest of the day dragged. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Every small sound outside made me freeze. As darkness fell, I stacked wood high in the stove and kept the lanterns burning brighter. I didn't want shadows in the corners. Late that night, I heard it again, the porch creaking. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, standing just feet from where I lay. My body felt frozen, my mind racing. I thought about yelling, but the silence was so deep it felt like yelling would break something fragile. I waited, barely breathing. After a long stretch, the creaking stopped. When I worked up the courage to check in the morning, I found fresh prints in the dirt by the porch. They were clearer than before. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night. I spent the next hours debating what to do. The cabin was far from town. My car was parked in the open. Whoever was out there had to know I was alone. I couldn't decide if it was safer to leave immediately or to stay locked inside. In the end, I stayed, because the idea of driving miles down an empty dirt road with someone possibly watching felt worse. That day passed in a fog of fear. I stayed inside with the door locked, only stepping out once to grab more wood. I kept imagining footsteps circling, eyes watching from the trees. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just a hunter, someone who stumbled onto the area. But why come at night? Why stand on the porch and leave without knocking? By the sixth night, I was barely sleeping at all. I sat up with the lantern lit, listening to every creak and rustle. At some point, I must have dozed, because I woke to the sound of the door handle turning. My chest clenched so hard it hurt. The handle rattled, slow at first, then harder. Whoever it was knew I was inside. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight. After what felt like forever, the rattling stopped. The next morning, I saw the prints again, more of them circling the cabin. They were fresh. I knew then that this wasn't an accident. Someone was deliberately watching me. I made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly, shoving everything into bags without care. My hands were clumsy, my stomach twisting. When I stepped outside, the woods felt too quiet, like they were waiting. I loaded the car fast, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. Then I climbed in and started the engine. As I backed down the dirt track, I caught sight of something in the trees. A figure, half hidden, standing completely still. Too far to see clearly, but I knew it wasn't a trick of light. My whole body went cold. I pressed the gas harder, not caring about the rough road, just wanting to put distance between me and that cabin. The drive back felt endless. Every curve of the road I expected to see a car following. Every open stretch I felt exposed. It wasn't until I hit the main highway hours later that I let myself breathe properly. I never went back for the rest of the week I had paid for. I never told the rental company what happened. All I knew was that someone had been there, watching, waiting, and I had no intention of finding out what they wanted. Even now, I think about the sound of the porch creaking, the slow rattle of the handle in the dark. I think about the figure in the trees, and I know that if I had stayed one more night, the story might not have ended with me driving away. I never liked being away from people for too long, but I told myself that some time alone would do me good. I had been living in the city for years, working the same routine job, dealing with noise and traffic every day, and I thought a week in a cabin would help me clear my head. I found a rental listing online. It wasn't one of those luxury cabins people go to for vacation. This one was old, small, and not updated. It was next to a lake that was surrounded by thick forest. The pictures showed wood walls that looked aged, a single bedroom, and a small deck that looked over the water. I figured it would be enough for me, since I only planned to read, hike, and sleep. The drive took longer than I thought. I left the city early in the morning, but the last 2 hours were nothing but winding back roads through forest and farmland. The closer I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I didn't see any at all. The trees grew taller, the road narrowed, and I kept glancing at my phone, but there was no signal. When I reached the small dirt road that the owner had described in the directions, I followed it slowly until the trees opened up and I saw the cabin. It sat right on the edge of the water, about 20 feet from the lake. The roof looked old but not falling apart. There was a small shed behind it, and a rowboat tied up at a short wooden dock. The place looked quiet, calm, and a little forgotten. I parked my car in the dirt clearing and carried my bags inside. The air smelled like damp wood the moment I stepped in. The floor creaked under my feet. There was only one main room with a small kitchen area, a couch, and a table. A hallway led to a bathroom and the single bedroom. Everything looked clean enough, though old. The bed was neatly made with plain sheets. The kitchen had only the basics: a small stove, a fridge, and a few cabinets with mismatched dishes. There was no TV, no internet, and no phone service. The only connection to the outside world was a landline phone on the wall, the kind with a cord, but it had a note taped above it that said, "For emergencies only." I unpacked my things slowly, setting my bag down by the bed, stacking the few books I brought on the nightstand, and putting food I had packed into the fridge. I didn't plan on going into town much. The closest one was 30 minutes away, and I didn't feel like wasting time on the road. I wanted to stay near the cabin, near the lake, and just relax. After settling in, I stepped outside and stood on the small deck. The lake was calm and still. The trees on the far side looked thick and endless. The only sound was the wind moving lightly through the branches. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without pressure. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple dinner, sat on the deck until the sun went down, and read a few chapters of my book. When I lay down in bed, I realized how quiet the night really was. I was used to the hum of traffic, sirens, and city life. Here, there was nothing but crickets and the occasional splash from the lake. I fell asleep quickly, though the silence felt strange. The next morning, I woke early. The light through the curtains was brighter than I expected, and the room was warm. I decided to take the rowboat out. I untied it from the dock, climbed in carefully, and started rowing. The water was calm, and the sound of the oars dipping in and out was steady and soft. I rowed toward the center of the lake and stopped, letting the boat drift. From there, the cabin looked small against the trees. I sat for a long time, staring at the water and listening to the forest. I thought it would feel peaceful, but there was something heavy about the quiet. The stillness seemed too strong, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I shook the thought off and rowed back to shore. The days passed slowly. I hiked around the trails that cut into the woods, though I never went too far, since I didn't want to get lost. The forest looked the same in every direction. Thick trees, damp ground, and long stretches where I couldn't see the sky. I stuck to paths where I could still hear the water behind me. Back at the cabin, I cooked simple meals, read, and tried to enjoy the break from the world. but the silence started to feel less like peace and more like something else. At night, I heard noises outside. Sometimes it sounded like branches snapping, sometimes like something moving near the shed. I told myself it was deer, raccoons, or other animals. Still, I found myself lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling, listening closely. By the fourth night, the noises became harder to ignore. I woke around midnight to the sound of what I thought was footsteps on the deck. I stayed still, my heart racing, and listened. The steps were slow, creaking against the old wood. Then they stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. I thought about turning on the light or looking out the window, but I couldn't move. After maybe an hour, I finally fell back asleep, though it was light and broken. In the morning, I checked the deck. Nothing looked different. No footprints, no marks. I convinced myself it was just an animal again, maybe a raccoon climbing onto the deck. I tried to ignore the unease and spent most of the day hiking to keep my mind busy. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The shed behind the cabin, which I hadn't opened since I arrived, looked slightly different. The padlock on the door was hanging loose. I was sure it had been locked before. I didn't remember touching it. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, wondering if maybe the owner had left it unlocked. I didn't open it. I didn't want to see what was inside. I just pushed the lock back through and left it hanging the way I found it. That night was worse. I woke again to the sound of movement outside, but this time it was different. It wasn't just steps. It sounded like something scraping against the wall of the cabin. A slow drag of metal or wood. Then a pause. Then again. I lay frozen in bed, my chest tight, listening to the sound circle the cabin. It moved from one wall to another, slow and steady. I wanted to believe it was branches from a tree moving in the wind, but there was no wind. The sound went on for what felt like hours. When the sun started to lighten the curtains, I finally sat up and forced myself to look outside. The yard looked empty. The shed stood still. The trees were quiet. I walked around the cabin carefully, checking the walls. On the side near the bedroom window, I saw marks. Thin scratches running along the wood, long and uneven. They weren't deep, but they looked fresh. I crouched down, staring at them, my stomach turning. They didn't look like animal scratches. They were too long, too controlled. I felt exposed standing there, so I went back inside and locked the door. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. Every sound from the forest made me jump. I thought about packing my things and leaving, but the idea of driving those narrow roads at night made me stay one more day. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the cabin being old, the forest being alive, and me being unused to the quiet. But that night broke me. I went to bed early, determined to sleep through whatever happened. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound so sharp it jolted me upright. It was the landline phone ringing. The shrill noise echoed through the cabin. I sat in the bed, staring down the hall at the faint outline of the phone on the wall. My heart pounded. I couldn't think of a reason it would ring. Nobody knew I was here. I hadn't given the number to anyone. Kept ringing, over and over, filling the silence. I couldn't make myself move. After maybe 10 rings, it stopped. The cabin went silent again. I sat there until dawn, not sleeping, barely breathing. When the sun rose, I packed everything I had into my bag. I didn't care if I left food behind. I didn't care if I left things out of place. I just wanted to leave. As I carried my bag out, I noticed the shed again. The lock wasn't hanging this time. The door was open a crack. I froze, staring at it, my skin crawling. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped closer and pushed the door just enough to see inside. The shed was empty except for a few tools on the wall, but the floor had something that made my stomach twist. A pile of cigarette butts, dozens of them crushed out in the dirt, fresh. Someone had been there recently, hiding out, smoking, close enough to watch the cabin. I didn't check further. I dropped my bag into the car, started the engine, and drove away fast, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road 2 hours later. My hands shook on the wheel the whole way. When I finally got phone service, I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but what would I say? That I heard noises? That I found cigarette butts? There was no proof of anything, just the feeling that I hadn't been alone. I drove back to the city and never went back to that cabin. Months later, I still think about it. I think about the footsteps on the deck, the scratches on the wall, the phone ringing in the night, and the open shed with its pile of cigarettes. Whoever was out there had been close the whole time, watching, waiting. I tell myself I was lucky to leave when I did. I never thought a simple trip out to a cabin in the woods would change the way I look at being alone in remote places. When I planned it, it sounded like a chance to get away from all the noise of daily life. I pictured quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, afternoons walking down long dirt paths, and evenings by a fire where the only sound was the wood popping. I wanted a break from screens, phones, traffic, and people. What I didn't think about was how easy it is to be cut off, how much you can miss things like a streetlight or a neighbor nearby, and how your mind reacts when you start to realize you might not be as alone as you first thought. The cabin wasn't mine. A coworker had told me about it. He said it belonged to a relative of his, and that nobody used it much anymore. It sat by a small lake, about 2 hours out from the nearest decent-sized town. I liked the idea right away. He gave me directions and told me where the key would be hidden. He made it sound like a simple thing. Drive up, unlock the place, spend a weekend. At the time, I thought the hardest part would be the drive, but I learned quickly that the drive was the easy part. The road leading to the cabin wasn't really a road the way most people think of one. It was narrow, made of dirt, and wound through a thick forest. Trees leaned over it, blocking out most of the sky, and there were no signs to tell me I was going the right way. My GPS had stopped being useful about 30 minutes before I got there, so I was relying only on the directions written on a piece of paper. I slowed down as I drove because the ground was uneven, and every so often I'd hit a dip that made the car rattle. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was dipping low. The place was small, built from old wood that had gone gray with age. The roof sagged a little in the middle and the windows looked dusty, but it was standing and that was all I needed. I killed the engine, stepped out, and the silence hit me harder than I expected. I thought I liked silence, but this was different. No cars, no voices, no hum of distant machines. Just the faint sound of wind moving through the trees and water lapping somewhere beyond the treeline. The key was exactly where I had been told it would be, taped up under the edge of the porch. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and damp air, the kind of smell you get in places that aren't used often. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a small kitchen against the wall, a table, and a couch that sagged a little. There was a small bedroom in the back with a bed and a thin mattress, and a bathroom with just the basics. No electricity, no running water except for a pump out back. I had brought bottled water, a cooler full of food, and a few lanterns. It was enough for the weekend. I set my things down, lit one of the lanterns, and went back outside to look at the lake. The trail down to it wasn't long. The water was still, dark, and smooth like glass. I could see trees on the other side leaning over the edge, their shapes stretching across the water. For a while, I stood there, trying to take it all in. The air was cool, the kind of cool that sticks to your skin when the sun goes down in the woods. Felt good, peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But that feeling didn't last. That first night, I had trouble falling asleep. It wasn't because of noise. In fact, it was the opposite. The silence was too deep. Every creak of the wood frame, every scratch of a branch against the side of the cabin felt louder than it should have. I lay on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening, waiting. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't stop. Eventually, I drifted off, but it wasn't restful. I woke up several times, sometimes sure I had heard something outside, other times just from the strange weight of being alone out there. In the morning, I tried to shake it off. I made coffee on a little camping stove I had brought, ate some food, and walked around the area. I told myself I was just getting used to it. By afternoon, I felt more relaxed. I even took a short nap on the couch, the lantern beside me. But when the sun started to drop again, I noticed that same feeling return, the one I couldn't explain. It was like being watched, like eyes were on me from somewhere just beyond the treeline. First, I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I was far from people, and my brain was probably overreacting to the quiet. Still, I found myself glancing at the windows often, checking the porch, listening harder than before. I kept the lantern lit even after I lay down that night. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was different from the usual creaks. It was a soft crunch, like footsteps on dirt. My eyes opened and my body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow, measured, moving along the outside of the cabin. I told myself it could be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the steps sounded heavier, more spaced out, deliberate. They stopped near the front porch, then nothing. Silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark, my chest tight, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. The next morning, I stepped outside carefully. The porch was empty. The dirt around it didn't show much, but I thought I saw impressions in the ground. Too large for a raccoon, too round for a deer. I crouched there for a while, staring, trying to decide if I was just imagining it. I went back inside and tried to ignore it, but my stomach felt heavy, and my skin prickled with unease. I tried to distract myself. I walked along the edge of the lake, explored a bit of the woods, and sat by the water. The more I moved around, the easier it was to forget about the sound in the night. But by the time I returned to the cabin, I noticed something else. The door. I was certain I had locked it that morning when I went out. I remembered the feel of turning the key, the click of the lock. But when I came back, it was unlocked. I stood there, staring at the knob. I tried to convince myself I had been careless, that maybe I had just thought I locked it but hadn't. Still, the thought dug into me as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Nothing looked moved. My things were where I left them, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone could have been inside. That night was worse. I didn't sleep much at all. I lay there listening to every sound. Once again, I heard the crunch of steps outside. This time, I stayed awake, staring toward the front door, gripping a heavy flashlight in my hand. The steps moved along the wall, paused near the window, then drifted away again. I didn't dare move. Hours passed, the lantern flickering weakly, and I waited for the sun to rise. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to spend another night there. I started packing my things, moving quickly, checking the windows often. That was when I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the window ledge by the front, pressed into the thin layer of dust, was the shape of a hand. Not mine, larger. The fingers spread wide. My chest went tight, and I froze in place. That meant someone had been there. Someone close enough to press their hand against the glass while I was inside. The thought made my stomach twist. I forced myself to finish packing, shoved everything into the car, and got ready to leave. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't catch. I tried again. Nothing. Just a weak click. I sat there gripping the wheel, panic rising. I had checked the car before leaving home. It had been fine. Now, after 2 nights here, it was dead. I got out, lifted the hood, and looked. I didn't know much about engines, but I knew enough to see that the battery cables had been loosened. Not by accident. Someone had done it on purpose. I had been looking forward to a quiet week alone. Life had been wearing me down for months, and I wanted nothing more than silence, space, and the kind of stillness that only comes from being deep in the woods, away from the constant grind of city noise. A coworker had mentioned a small cabin they had once stayed at years ago, tucked off a dirt road in the northern part of the state. It wasn't part of any big rental company. The place was privately owned, and from the outside it looked like an old hunting cabin that someone had decided to rent out to make a bit of extra cash. That was exactly what I wanted. Something isolated. Something away from everything. The drive out there had already tested me. It was early autumn, and the trees were starting to turn. The 2-lane highway eventually narrowed into winding roads, then into gravel, then into what could barely be considered a road at all. My car bumped and jolted as I crawled through potholes. Each mile cut me off further from anything resembling civilization. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun had already dropped low enough that the trees were casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin sat alone in a patch of grass surrounded by tall pines. It looked like it hadn't been painted in years. The logs were weathered gray, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch was uneven, but it stood solid enough. To me, it looked perfect. There was a rusted propane tank beside the structure, a small shed to the back, and an outhouse off to one side. I hauled my bags inside and was met with the kind of smell old cabins always carry. Aged wood, a trace of dampness, and something like smoke soaked deep into the walls. The interior was plain. A small wood stove sat in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a counter with a sink that I quickly realized wasn't hooked up to running water, a few shelves with mismatched dishes. There was one small bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. Nothing about the place suggested comfort, but that was fine by me. I wanted rough edges. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a quick meal, sat on the porch with a lantern, and listened to the forest hum with insects. It was darker than anything I'd been around in years. No streetlights, no glow of towns in the distance, just thick blackness pressing against the clearing. But the silence I expected wasn't really there. The woods were loud in their own way, crickets, frogs, the occasional snap of a branch. I reminded myself that I was in their space, not the other way around. I felt uneasy at first, but eventually grew used to it and drifted off to sleep. The following days passed slowly. I explored the trails around the cabin, walked down to a stream about a mile away, collected firewood, and tried to sink into a rhythm that didn't involve clocks or screens. My phone had no service. I had planned for that, but the full weight of isolation didn't settle in until the 3rd day. That was when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. It was early morning. I had gone outside to split some kindling. The air was cold, and my breath hung in front of me. As I carried the wood back to the porch, I saw prints in the mud near the tree line. They weren't boot prints I recognized from myself, and they weren't animal tracks either. They were footprints, bare feet. The ground was damp enough that the impressions were clear. Toes, heels. The stride was long. I froze and just stared at them. They came out of the woods, crossed halfway into the clearing, then turned back. The size looked bigger than my own foot. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe they were old. Maybe someone had been here before me and I just hadn't noticed until now. But the ground had been soaked by rain the night before. These prints were fresh. The uneasiness I felt then never fully went away. For the rest of that day, I caught myself glancing at the trees more than usual. Every sound carried more weight. I locked the door that night, even though the flimsy latch wouldn't stop anyone serious about coming in. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if I had been imagining things. More prints, this time circling the shed in the back. Still bare, still fresh. I started paying more attention. Each evening before dark, I would scan the tree line to see if anyone was out there. I never saw anyone, but I knew someone had been around. On the 5th night, as I lay in bed, I heard something that pulled the last of my calm away. It was faint at first, but steady enough that I couldn't convince myself I had imagined it. Footsteps on the porch, slow, creaking wood under weight. Whoever it was didn't knock. They didn't try the door. They just walked across the boards, stopped for a while, and then eventually moved away. I lay there holding my breath, staring at the ceiling, feeling every muscle locked tight. My heart slammed in my chest. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the boards had grown the way they only do under human weight. By morning, nothing was out of place. The door was still shut. The clearing was quiet again. But from then on, sleep didn't come easy. Each day, I told myself I was overreacting, that isolation was playing tricks on me. But every night, I heard something else. The sound of twigs breaking close to the cabin. A soft scrape against the siding. Once, what sounded like low breathing outside the window. I kept the lantern burning late into the night, but I knew light only helped me see. It wouldn't stop someone determined. On the seventh day, I found proof that locked me into full fear. I had left an axe stuck into a stump outside where I split wood. That morning, it was gone. I searched around, thinking maybe I had misplaced it. After a half hour, I found it leaned against the cabin wall just under the bedroom window. That meant whoever was coming around had taken it, carried it, and placed it right where I slept. I felt sick. My hands shook as I picked it up. The blade was damp from dew, but otherwise clean. I thought about leaving that day, but the road back was rough, and part of me thought maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was imagining connections that weren't there. I convinced myself to stay one more night, but I moved a chair under the doorknob and kept the axe inside with me. That night was the longest of my life. The noises started soon after I blew out the lantern. First, just the forest as usual. Then the sound of branches snapping. Closer this time. Then slow steps across the porch again. The door rattled softly, like someone was testing the chair I had wedged there. I held the axe across my lap in the dark, listening, barely breathing. Hours passed. My legs cramped from staying so still. Eventually, the noises faded. Dawn came pale and cold through the cracks in the curtains. I had survived the night, but I felt hollow, drained, and on edge. I didn't bother packing neatly. I stuffed what I could into bags, loaded the car, and left. The road felt longer on the way out, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the paved highway, I pulled over and sat with my head against the steering wheel, shaking. The week had been nothing like I had planned. Instead of peace, I had found a kind of terror that still feels hard to explain. I never saw the person who came around the cabin. I don't know what they wanted. They never broke in, never attacked, never left any message. But they watched, they circled, they touched things. They wanted me to know they had been there. That knowledge has stayed with me. I still think about the prints in the mud, the axe under the window, the sound of steps on the porch. I went out there looking for quiet. What I found instead was the kind of silence that watches you back. I had always thought of cabins as peaceful places. When I pictured them, I thought about silence, trees swaying outside the windows, maybe the crackling sound of a fire in the wood stove. I never thought about fear when I thought about them. I had stayed in a few over the years, sometimes with family, sometimes alone, and they had always been calm places to clear my mind. But one trip changed the way I saw cabins forever. It started as nothing more than a weekend escape. I had been feeling burnt out from work, sitting for hours in front of my computer, living in a cycle of sleep, eat, and repeat. I wanted to disconnect and be somewhere that felt far away from everything. That was how I ended up renting a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It wasn't a fancy rental, not one of those new shiny ones you see online. This one was old, hidden among pine trees, a place you found by following narrow dirt roads that twisted and disappeared into silence. The road to the cabin was rough. My car rattled over potholes, and branches brushed the sides of it as if the forest wanted to swallow me whole. The air felt different the deeper I drove. Thicker, heavier, colder. There were no houses along the road, no sign of life, just tree after tree after tree. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The cabin sat in a small clearing. Its wood was dark and aged, the kind that made you wonder how many winters it had already survived. The roof looked patched in spots, and the porch leaned slightly, but it stood strong. Behind it, the forest stretched endlessly. In front of it, a small dirt patch worked as a driveway, though it looked like cars hadn't rolled over it in months. I parked and stepped out. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no birds chirping, no wind whistling, not even the hum of insects, just stillness. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have as I carried my bags to the porch. The wooden boards groaned under my weight. I fished the key out of my pocket, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air inside smelled of wood, dust, and something else. Something stale, like it hadn't been opened in a long time. The cabin had only 2 rooms. The front room had a small kitchen against one wall, an old table with 2 chairs, and a couch near a stone fireplace. The second room was the bedroom with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single small window. The place was simple, almost too simple, but it was what I had wanted. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake off the unease. I kept telling myself that cabins always smelled like that if they hadn't been used in a while. That silence was normal in places far from towns. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew I was miles from anyone. That first day passed quietly. I walked the trails near the cabin, collected some fallen branches for the fire, and cooked a simple meal on the small stove. As the sun dipped lower, the forest around me grew darker quicker than I expected. By the time I lit the oil lamp inside, the cabin was surrounded by heavy blackness. It wasn't the normal kind of night I was used to. Back home, there was always some kind of light, streetlights, neighbors' windows, headlights from cars. Here, the dark was absolute. When I looked out the window, I saw nothing, not even the outlines of trees. Felt like the cabin was floating in a void. That night, lying in bed, I struggled to sleep. Every sound felt louder in the silence. The creak of the wood, the wind brushing the walls, the faint scratch of branches. My body felt heavy, my mind alert. It wasn't fear yet, just discomfort, like my instincts didn't trust the place. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next day, I tried to settle in. I explored farther into the woods, following faint trails that twisted among the trees. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how wild it all felt. The forest floor was uneven, filled with roots and rocks. Fallen trees rotted quietly in the shade. I saw deer tracks, and once I spotted a rabbit darting through the underbrush, but mostly, it was empty. After hours of wandering, I turned back. I had marked the trees with small ribbons I'd brought, just in case, but even with them, I realized how easy it was to get lost. The trees looked the same in every direction, and the sky was barely visible through the thick canopy. When I finally saw the clearing of the cabin again, relief washed over me. That night, things changed. I sat in the front room after dinner, the oil lamp casting a soft yellow glow across the walls. I had a book with me, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the window. It was that same absolute blackness outside, pressing against the glass. I found myself staring into it, as if something might move out there. The silence was so thick I could hear my heartbeat. Then I heard it, a crunch. It was faint, but it was there. The sound of something stepping on dry leaves came from outside, near the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. The sound didn't come again right away. Seconds stretched, then minutes, and I started to wonder if I had imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time. I moved to the lamp and turned down the flame until the room was nearly dark. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I crept to the window. I pressed myself to the side of the frame and peeked out. I couldn't see anything, just endless black. But I knew I had heard it. Something was out there. I stood there for what felt like an hour, staring into the dark, waiting. The crunch of leaves came again, then again, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My chest tightened. It wasn't the random movement of an animal. It was too steady. Circled once, then twice, then stopped. I didn't move the rest of the night. I sat in the chair, oil lamp turned low, eyes fixed on the window. The sounds didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there in the dark, watching. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside. The clearing looked the same as before, but I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the ground. That was when I saw them, footprints, human footprints. They circled the cabin in the dirt, leading off into the trees. My stomach dropped. I told myself it could have been an old hunter's tracks, or maybe some hiker who had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew they were fresh. The soil was still dark and pressed. Someone had been there, walking around the cabin while I sat inside, frozen in fear. I spent that day on edge. I barely ate. I barely moved. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the tree line. The forest looked the same, calm and still, but I couldn't shake the thought of those steps circling me. That night was worse. I tried to convince myself it wouldn't happen again, that maybe whoever it was had just passed through. But when the darkness fell, the same sound came back. The crunch of leaves, slow steps, deliberate. This time, I didn't go to the window. I stayed still, sitting in the chair, the lamp off, my ears strained with every sound. The steps circled once more. Then they stopped at the porch. The boards creaked. Something or someone was standing right outside the door. My whole body went cold. I stared at the door, waiting for the knob to turn, waiting for the wood to splinter. But it didn't. After a long time, the steps moved again, fading slowly into the forest. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed. I shoved everything into my bags without care. My plan was to leave, to drive out and never look back. But when I stepped outside, my stomach turned again. The footprints were back, fresh and clear, circling the cabin. But this time there were more. Not just one set, two. I drove out that day, my hands shaking on the wheel as I bounced over the rough dirt road. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe until I reached the main road and saw other cars, other people. I never went back to that cabin. I never wanted to. Even now, years later, I can still hear the sound of those steps in the dark. The slow crunch of leaves, the weight of someone circling, waiting, watching. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I had been feeling drained for weeks from work and city life. So when I found a listing for a small rental cabin tucked away in a remote patch of forest, I booked it without much thought. The description promised quiet, solitude, and hiking trails that weren't overrun with tourists. It sounded like the kind of break I desperately needed. The pictures showed a simple one-bedroom wooden structure with a porch, an old stone fireplace, and tall pine trees pressing close on all sides. It didn't look luxurious, but that wasn't what I was after. I just wanted to breathe fresh air, hear the wind through the trees, and sit by a fire without the noise of neighbors or traffic. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The paved road narrowed into cracked asphalt, then eventually into a gravel path that climbed deeper into the woods. My phone lost reception about an hour before I arrived, and from that point on, it was just me, my car, and the constant crunch of gravel under my tires. I passed no other vehicles, no houses, not even a sign of a person. The trees grew denser and taller the farther I went, their branches forming a kind of tunnel that blocked out most of the sky. It was both calming and unsettling. I liked the idea of being alone, but I hadn't realized just how alone I would be. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked beside it and stepped out. The place looked exactly like the photos. Weathered wood, a sloped roof, and a porch with a rocking chair. The air was cooler than back in the city, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp soil. I carried my bags inside and looked around. The interior was small but clean, with one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a living space dominated by the stone fireplace. There was a small bathroom tucked in the corner. A stack of firewood leaned against the wall outside, and the kitchen had the basics: some canned goods, a few pans, and a note about the nearest town being nearly an hour's drive away. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked, set my things on the bed, and then walked the perimeter of the cabin just to get a feel for the land. The ground was uneven, with moss and roots everywhere. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched on endlessly, no trails in sight. In front, the gravel road curved back out of view. I noticed how quiet it was. Not just the usual quiet of the woods, but a stillness that felt heavier. No distant highway hum, no neighbors, not even the faint sound of planes overhead. Just birds now and then, and the creaking of trees swaying in the wind. That night, I made a small fire in the fireplace and sat on the floor watching the flames. I wrote a little in my notebook, listened to the fire pop, and eventually crawled into bed. It took a long time to fall asleep, not because I wasn't tired, but because the silence pressed on me in a way I wasn't used to. Every tiny noise in the cabin, the settling wood, the shifting of the fire, stood out sharp in the dark. The next morning, I decided to hike a bit, even though there weren't any marked trails nearby. I figured I could just walk in a straight line for a while and then turn back. The woods were dense, the ground littered with pine needles, and the air cool enough to keep me comfortable as I walked. After about 30 minutes, I realized how easy it would be to get lost. The trees looked the same in every direction, and without a path or markers, it all blurred together. I forced myself to stop and turn back before I went too far. When the cabin came back into view, I felt relief wash over me. I made a mental note not to stray too deep without better preparation. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with a book. Hours slipped by, and I noticed something strange. I hadn't heard a single person or car since I arrived. That wasn't unusual for such a remote place, but it hit me just how isolated I was. If something happened, an accident, an injury, I'd have to drive nearly an hour before reaching anyone. That thought lingered longer than I wanted it to. The second night was harder. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just enough to snap me awake. A crunch like a footstep on gravel or leaves. I froze in bed, straining my ears. For a long minute, nothing followed. I told myself it was probably an animal, deer, raccoon, maybe even a stray dog, but I couldn't shake the unease. I waited, listening, until sleep eventually pulled me back under. The following morning, I checked outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove something had been there. Still, I felt uneasy, as if I had imagined it. To distract myself, I spent the day chopping a little firewood, organizing the cabin, and walking a short distance down the gravel road. The road stretched on, turning deeper into the trees with no sign of another house. I didn't follow it far, worried about wasting energy, but the emptiness of it unsettled me. That evening, I cooked a simple meal on the stove and tried to settle down again. But as the sun dropped, I couldn't ignore how on edge I felt. The woods outside grew darker, and the cabin seemed smaller. I checked the locks on the doors twice, then 3 times. The silence pressed in again. When I finally lay in bed, I left the lamp on. Sleep came in fragments, broken by small noises I wasn't sure were real or imagined. By the 3rd day, I was starting to question if the cabin had been a mistake. I had come here for peace, but instead I felt wound tight, nerves stretched thin. I told myself I'd give it one more night. If I couldn't relax, I'd pack up and head home early. That afternoon, while sitting on the porch, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond where the gravel road bent out of sight, the dirt looked disturbed. It wasn't obvious at first, but the more I stared, the more it looked like footprints. Not animal tracks, but longer, narrower shapes, human. They seemed to lead out of the woods and onto the gravel. I stood up and walked toward them, trying to keep calm. The closer I got, the more convinced I became. They were footprints. They weren't large, but they were definitely human. They crossed the edge of the clearing and vanished into the trees. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding. There was no reason for anyone to be out here barefoot. There were no other cabins nearby, no trails, no campgrounds. The air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I went back inside and locked the door again. That night was worse. I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard it again, movement outside. Slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The steps came closer, circled the cabin, and then faded away. I didn't move, too afraid to even peek out the window. My mind ran in loops. Who would come out here? Why barefoot? Were they watching me? When daylight came, I forced myself to check outside. The ground around the cabin was littered with disturbed pine needles. The footprints were faint but clear enough to know I hadn't imagined it. They had circled the entire cabin. My stomach turned as I realized they had stopped by the porch, right near the steps, before moving off again. I knew then that staying was no longer an option. I packed my bag in a rush, barely caring how neatly things fit. Every sound outside made me jump, convinced I'd see someone standing there. When my car was loaded, I sat in the driver's seat and started the engine, relief flooding me just from the sound. As I drove down the gravel road, I kept checking the mirror. My pulse didn't slow until the trees began to thin and the first hint of civilization returned. By the time I reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop until I was hours away. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked pale, exhausted, shaken. I knew I'd never go back to that cabin. The woods had given me exactly what I asked for: silence, solitude, but not in the way I wanted. Someone had been out there with me, moving around the cabin in the night, leaving bare footprints at the edge of the trees. I would never know who or why, and I was fine never knowing. The cabin had felt like an escape when I booked it, but I left with the sharp reminder that isolation wasn't peace. It was vulnerability. Out there, far from help, surrounded by miles of forest, I wasn't alone, and that truth clung to me even after I was safe at home. I had been needing some time away from the noise of life. Too many things had been piling up on me at once, and I felt like I was drowning under the weight of work, bills, and the endless cycle of stress that never seemed to let up. When a coworker mentioned he had a family cabin out in the woods, one he rarely used anymore, I asked if he would rent it to me for a week. He agreed, told me it was bare bones but solid, and gave me directions that wound through back roads until the pavement ended and dirt carried on for miles. The drive out there felt longer than it really was. I kept glancing at the gas gauge, even though I had filled up before leaving. My phone lost signal halfway down a stretch of cracked asphalt, and I realized how alone I would be once I reached the cabin. No calls, no texts, no internet. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. That had been the point of going, of course, but the silence felt heavier the closer I got. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was slipping lower behind the trees. The dirt road was narrow, rutted in places, and hemmed in by thick walls of pine. My tires kicked up dust that hung in the air like smoke. After several miles of bouncing along, I finally saw the roofline of the cabin through the trees. It sat in a small clearing, dark with siding blending into the surrounding forest. The porch sagged slightly, but the place looked sturdy enough. The windows reflected the last light of the day, making them look almost like black mirrors. I parked beside a half-rotted woodpile and hauled my bags inside. The interior was plain. A single main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with running water that I hoped wouldn't betray me in the middle of the week. The furniture was old but functional. A sagging couch, a heavy oak table, a few mismatched chairs. There was dust in the corners, but not so much that it seemed abandoned. I opened the windows to air it out, listening to the quiet that pressed in from outside. That first night passed without much trouble. I unpacked, cooked a simple meal on the propane stove, and sat by the window as the forest darkened. The silence was complete, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of wind in the trees. When I went to bed, I lay awake for a long time listening to the absence of noise I was used to in the city. No cars, no distant sirens, no hum of neighbors through thin walls, just stillness. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The cabin was surrounded by thick forest, with a faint trail leading down toward what my coworker had called a creek. I followed it for a while, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots and the faint sound of running water ahead. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, sharp and clean. The creek itself was wide and shallow, tumbling over smooth stones. I sat there for a long while, letting the water's steady sound ease something tight in my chest. I returned to the cabin feeling lighter. The day passed slowly, and I didn't mind. I chopped some wood, cooked, read a book I had brought, and dozed on the couch. When night came, I settled into bed again, staring up at the ceiling until sleep pulled me under. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint, distant, but sharp enough to pull me from sleep. A crack, like wood snapping. I lay still, listening. The cabin was dark, the kind of heavy dark where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. My heart thudded louder as I tried to make sense of the sound. Animals could snap branches easily enough, I told myself. The woods were full of deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I forced myself to breathe evenly until the silence settled back in. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next day, I brushed it off as nothing. But as the hours went by, I caught myself glancing out the windows more often. The woods felt different, not threatening exactly, but heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching. I laughed at the thought, shook my head, and tried to focus on the book I was reading. That night, I woke again, this time to the creak of wood. Not the sharp snap of a branch, but the slow groan of a floorboard. Inside the cabin, I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. My mind scrambled through possibilities. The cabin was old. Could have been the wood settling, or maybe the wind pressing against it. But it hadn't been windy, and the sound had been too sharp, too deliberate. I lay there, straining my ears, barely daring to breathe. Nothing followed, just silence. I told myself I was imagining things, that being out here alone was playing tricks on me. Still, it took hours before sleep finally came again. The following morning, I checked every door and window. All were locked, just as I had left them. The cabin was small enough that I would have noticed if anyone had actually been inside. But the unease settled deeper into me, a weight I couldn't shake. Over the next days, the noises continued, always at night. Sometimes sharp cracks outside, sometimes faint shuffling near the porch, sometimes creaks from within the cabin itself. I never saw anything. Every time I looked out a window or stepped outside with a flashlight, there was nothing but the still forest. Sleep became harder. I lay awake most nights, staring into the dark, ears straining for every sound. During the day, I found myself jumping at the smallest noises. A squirrel darting through leaves made my pulse spike. The snap of a twig had me whipping my head toward the trees. By the fourth night, I hadn't slept more than a few hours total. My nerves felt raw. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Human prints. Not boots like mine, but shoes. They circled near the woodpile and then led back toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They hadn't been there before. The realization hit me harder than I expected. Someone had been here. I locked the doors tighter, checked the windows again and again, and tried to calm myself. But that night, when the noises came again, they were closer, louder. I lay in bed, every nerve screaming. The creaks inside the cabin sounded deliberate now, as if someone was moving slowly, carefully. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. My week wasn't up, but I couldn't take another night in that cabin. I packed quickly, stuffing clothes into my bag, checking over my shoulder constantly. But when I went out to the car, my heart dropped. The tires were slashed, all four of them. I stood there in the clearing, the silence pressing down harder than ever, my breath loud in my ears. Someone had been here. Someone wanted me to stay. I forced myself back inside, bolting the door, my hands shaking. My phone still had no signal. I sat at the table, staring at the walls, feeling the weight of the woods pressing closer around me. Hours crawled by and night fell again. That night was the worst. The noises started earlier. Footsteps outside the walls, scraping along the porch. The sound of the doorknob rattling, slow and deliberate. I sat in the dark, clutching the heavy fire poker I had pulled from beside the stove, every muscle tense. Hours passed like that. The sounds would come, then fade, then return again, closer each time. At one point, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing just outside the bedroom door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Eventually, the sounds faded again. I sat there until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the windows. When morning came, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag, shoved the essentials inside, and started walking. The dirt road stretched for miles, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying another night. I walked fast, glancing back every few minutes, expecting to see someone step out of the trees behind me. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I didn't stop. Hours passed before I finally reached the cracked asphalt of the main road. Not long after, a passing truck slowed, and the driver gave me a wary look as he offered a ride. I climbed in, too exhausted to care about appearances. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. When I finally reached town, I called for help with the car, but I never went back to that cabin. I didn't want to see what else I might find there. The week I had planned to spend relaxing in the quiet woods had turned into something I would never forget. Even now, I can still hear those noises when I close my eyes. The deliberate creak of floorboards, the sound of someone just outside the door, waiting. I never found out who it was or why they wanted me trapped there, and maybe that was worse than knowing. I had been needing some time away from everything, so when a coworker mentioned a small cabin rental up north, tucked deep into the woods and far from the nearest road, I didn't think twice before booking it for a week. It was early autumn, the kind of season when the air feels crisp but not yet cold, when the leaves are already starting to turn colors but still cling to their branches. I wanted quiet, stillness, a place where I could think without hearing the buzz of traffic or the endless noise of the city. The cabin was advertised as being remote, with no nearby neighbors and only a dirt track leading in. That appealed to me more than anything else. I had grown tired of people, of noise, of schedules. I wanted to hear nothing but wind through trees, the sound of my own boots crunching over pine needles, maybe the crack of a fire at night. I left on a Sunday morning, loaded up with enough food to last the week, a heavy flashlight, batteries, a camp axe, and the usual outdoor gear. I wasn't a survival expert or anything like that, but I liked the woods, and I knew enough to be comfortable in them. The drive out took longer than expected. Once I turned off the main highway, the road narrowed into twisting lanes bordered by thick pine forest. The GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on the directions the owner had emailed me. Eventually, after what felt like hours of bouncing along a dirt path full of ruts and rocks, the trees opened just enough to reveal a small clearing. The cabin sat in the center of that clearing. It was simple, one story with a front porch and a pitched roof. Weathered wood siding gave it a worn look, but not abandoned. Smoke stains marked the chimney, and stacked firewood leaned under a tarp beside the porch. A thin trail curved around the back, probably leading down toward the creek the owner had mentioned. The place looked quiet, even peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and wood smoke. The main room held a small table, a couple of chairs, and a wood stove. Off to the side was a single bedroom with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the trees. There was no electricity, only oil lamps and a propane lantern. No running water either, just a pump outside near the back. I liked it, felt stripped down, simple, disconnected. That first day passed without anything unusual. I unloaded my gear, stored food in a cooler on the porch, and chopped some firewood. The sun dropped early behind the tall trees, and the forest darkened in a way I wasn't used to. By the time I lit the lantern and sat at the table to eat, the clearing outside had disappeared into a black wall of pines. There was no glow from a nearby town, no lights from houses in the distance, just complete darkness pressing against the windows. I found it calming, even though a small part of me felt uneasy at how total it was. That night, I lay in the narrow bed listening to the woods. The silence wasn't true silence. The forest had its own sounds, branches creaking, owls hooting, small animals scurrying through dry leaves. Now and then, I thought I heard something larger moving farther off, maybe a deer or an elk, but nothing close. I slept off and on, waking several times without knowing why, then drifting again. By morning, light filtered through the window, pale and cold, and I felt more rested. The days began to settle into a rhythm. I hiked the trail behind the cabin, followed the creek, collected firewood, read books I had brought, and cooked simple meals. The quiet was what I wanted, and I felt it working on me. My head cleared, my body slowed down. I sat on the porch for long stretches, just staring at the trees. It was the third night when I noticed something that didn't fit. I had woken up sometime past midnight. The cabin was dark, except for the faint orange glow from the last embers in the stove. I didn't know why I was awake at first, but then I realized I was listening. The usual night sounds seemed absent. No owls, no rustling, just stillness. Then I heard it, a crunch of leaves, faint but clear, somewhere in the woods beyond the clearing. Not close, but not far either. My first thought was deer. They moved at night often, I held my breath and waited, expecting another step. The sound came again, deliberate, slow, one after another. I pictured hooves pressing into the leaves, but something about the spacing felt wrong. It sounded heavier, human almost. I stayed in bed, staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The sounds came a few more times, then stopped altogether. After half an hour of silence, I finally drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I told myself it had been nothing. The woods were full of noises. You could always convince yourself something was there when it wasn't. Still, I found myself looking at the edge of the trees as I made coffee on the camp stove. The forest seemed thicker than before, darker, as if it were leaning in. That afternoon, I decided to check the area where I thought the noises had come from. I walked across the clearing and into the trees. The ground was soft with layers of needles and leaves. I moved slowly, scanning for tracks. After a while, I found a patch of disturbed ground. A few leaves shifted aside in a way that looked unnatural. Crouching, I studied them. They weren't hoof marks. They were flat, long impressions, faint but there. Boot prints. A cold feeling spread through me as I stared at them. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. The nearest property was miles away. Who would be walking near here in the middle of the night? I tried to reason it out. Maybe hunters passing through, maybe someone lost. Still, I didn't like it. I circled back to the cabin, locking the door even though the lock was little more than a flimsy latch. For the rest of the day, I stayed closer than usual, always glancing at the trees. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I lay awake, listening. The forest returned to its normal chorus of sounds, and I started to relax. But sometime later, I woke again. First, I didn't know why. Then I realized the noises were back. Slow steps crunching through the leaves. This time, they were closer. I sat up, heart pounding, and stared at the window. I couldn't see anything, only the blackness of the trees. The steps continued, circling, pausing, then starting again. Whoever it was, they weren't rushing. They were moving carefully, deliberately, just outside the clearing. I stayed frozen in bed until the sounds faded away. Even after they stopped, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing someone standing out there, just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing again. I found more prints, fresh. They weren't mine. By now, my sense of peace had evaporated. I felt watched, unsettled. I kept the axe closer. I checked the door and windows multiple times. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the trees. The forest no longer felt empty, felt occupied. The following nights got worse. The noises returned, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Always slow, always deliberate. Once, I heard what sounded like the snap of a branch, sharp and loud in the stillness. Another time, I thought I saw a shadow shift at the edge of the clearing, though when I blinked, it was gone. Days became tense. I hardly hiked anymore, too uneasy about leaving the cabin behind. I rationed my food more carefully, even though I had enough. I couldn't shake the thought that someone wanted me to feel afraid. Then came the sixth night. The footsteps didn't stay at the edge. They came right up to the cabin. I woke to the sound of them on the porch, heavy boards creaking under weight. My chest locked tight as I sat rigid in bed, every muscle tensed. I heard the slow scrape of boots across wood, then a pause right outside the door. The latch rattled softly. My pulse roared in my ears. The person didn't come inside. After a moment, the steps retreated. The boards creaked again, then silence. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the door. In daylight, I stepped out cautiously. The porch boards showed clear prints in the thin layer of dust. Boot treads. Someone had been there, no question. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay another night. The cabin no longer felt like a retreat, felt like a trap. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They had been circling me for nights, closing in, testing the door. I packed my things quickly, shoving gear into bags without order. I doused the stove, closed the shutters, and loaded everything into the truck. The drive back down the dirt track felt endless, every bump and rut making me glance at the mirror half expecting someone to appear behind me. When I finally reached the highway, relief flooded through me. The wide open road, the presence of other vehicles, it all felt safe again. I didn't stop until I was nearly home. That night, lying in my own bed, I couldn't stop replaying it. The prints, the footsteps, the way they had circled, closing in. Whoever it was, they never revealed themselves. They never knocked, never called out. They just watched, waited. I had been needing a break for months. Work was eating me alive. City noise kept me awake at night, and I felt like I had forgotten what silence even sounded like. That was when I decided to rent a small cabin out in the woods, far from the constant traffic and glowing streetlights. I wanted quiet. I wanted air that didn't smell like exhaust fumes. I wanted to be somewhere I could hear my own thoughts without a phone buzzing every 10 minutes. The cabin wasn't much. A single-story wooden box tucked away at the end of a long dirt road that snaked through miles of forest. It was the kind of place most people would drive past without noticing. The roof slanted slightly, the wood was weathered gray, and the porch steps creaked under my weight the first time I climbed them. But it had what I needed: a bed, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and 4 walls that separated me from the world. The rental site had described it as a rustic off-grid retreat. That description didn't exaggerate. There was no phone signal once I left the main road. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no power lines humming outside. Just the cabin and the trees pressing in from every side. The only connection to the outside world was a small trail leading back to the dirt road where I had parked my car. That road stretched for about 6 miles before it met the nearest highway. Beyond that, another 20 minutes to reach a gas station. I was fine with that. I had brought enough supplies for a week. Canned food, bottled water, a few gallons of gasoline for the small generator, and some tools I figured might come in handy. I even packed a first aid kit just in case. I thought I had thought of everything. The first 2 days were calm. I woke up with the sun, cooked breakfast on the little propane stove, and sat on the porch drinking coffee while the forest came alive with sound. Birds chirped in waves, insects buzzed, and squirrels darted up and down trees with frantic energy. At night, the woods went quiet in a way that made the silence feel heavy, like the trees were leaning in to listen. I found myself falling asleep earlier than I ever did in the city, lulled by the crackling of the wood stove and the soft rustle of wind through the branches. On the 3rd night, I noticed something. It wasn't a sound at first. It was the absence of sound. The woods outside were silent, but not in the peaceful way they had been before. It was more like the silence that follows when something interrupts nature, like when you walk through the forest and all the birds stop chirping at once. That night, I sat in bed staring at the ceiling, the only sound the faint hiss of the stove fire. My ears strained for anything, but the woods stayed still. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of footsteps on gravel. The next morning, I brushed it off. Dreams stick like that sometimes. I made oatmeal, chopped firewood, and went for a short walk down the dirt trail toward the road. I wanted to stretch my legs. About half a mile from the cabin, I saw it. A footprint. It was pressed into a patch of soft mud beside the trail. It wasn't mine. I had been wearing heavy hiking boots, but this one was smaller, narrower, like a sneaker print. The edges were fresh, not smoothed over by rain or wind. I crouched down and stared at it longer than I needed to, my mind turning over questions I didn't want to ask. Who else would be walking out here? I stood up and looked around, but the woods gave me nothing. Just endless trees and the same dirt trail stretching in both directions. I told myself it was probably old, that someone had taken a walk days ago before I arrived. That explanation didn't sit well, though. The print was too sharp, too recent. I walked back to the cabin faster than before. That night, I set the lock on the door. The cabin had a simple latch, nothing more. I wedged a chair under the handle too, just to be safe. Lying in bed, I listened harder than ever. My eyes stayed open long after the fire burned down. The silence outside pressed against the walls, thicker than the night before. And then, faintly, I heard it. Crunch. A single step outside. I froze, every muscle in my body rigid. My ears strained again. Crunch. Another step. It was slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully across the gravel path that circled the cabin. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. The sound moved, not in a straight line, but in a slow arc, like someone circling. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. The sounds eventually faded, but I stayed awake until dawn lit the cracks in the wooden walls. In the morning, I walked outside. My hands shook as I gripped the door handle, bracing myself for what I might see. At first, everything looked normal. The porch steps, the dirt path, the firewood stacked neatly against the wall. But then I saw them. Footprints. They circled the cabin. Not just once, but several times, weaving close to the windows and back toward the trees. Some were deep, pressed into the soft earth where the ground was still damp from last week's rain. Others crossed over each other, like whoever it was had been pacing. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't an old print on a trail. Someone had been here. Someone had walked circles around my cabin in the middle of the night while I was inside. The next hours blurred together. I went inside, locked the door, and sat at the table with my thoughts racing. My mind threw up options, each worse than the last. I could pack up and drive out, but the dirt road was long, and if whoever it was came back, they could catch me out there. I could stay and wait it out, but then what? Just sit inside hoping they didn't come back? I decided to make myself less vulnerable. I checked every window, every door, every weak spot in the walls. I pushed the dresser against the front door, stacked heavy wood inside the back door frame, and made sure the generator had fuel in case I needed light. That night was worse. I sat in the dark, the only light a small lantern. Hours ticked by. My heartbeat never slowed. Then, just past midnight, it started again. Crunch. A step outside. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was closer, slower, dragging across the gravel like weight shifting on purpose. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. The steps circled again, tracing the same slow path as before. Around the cabin, stopping near the windows, pausing by the porch. At one point, the steps stopped right outside the front door. I could hear breathing, not loud, but steady, just on the other side of the wood. I held my breath so hard my chest ached. After what felt like forever, the breathing faded. The steps moved again, circling once more before melting into silence. When daylight came, I found more prints. Fresh ones, heavier, as if whoever it was had stood longer in certain spots. One set led straight up to the porch steps before turning back. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my bag as fast as I could, shoving everything I had into it. Food, water, clothes, flashlight, batteries. I left behind what I couldn't carry. My only thought was to get back to the car and leave. I didn't care if I lost the rental deposit. I just wanted to be gone. But when I stepped outside, my heart stopped. The path to the road was blocked. Branches had been dragged across it, thick ones, snapped off and laid in a rough barricade. It wasn't natural. It wasn't storm damage. Someone had put them there, stacked deliberately to cut me off. I turned back to the cabin, my chest tight. My mind screamed at me that I was trapped. Whoever had been circling me at night wasn't just wandering. They knew I was here. They wanted me to stay here. The rest of that day was survival mode. I took inventory again, counted food and water, checked the locks twice over. Every shadow outside the window made me flinch. Every creak of the wood felt like footsteps. That night, the steps came earlier. Crunch, crunch. The circling began before the sun had fully set. Slow, steady, patient. Around and around, like a predator wearing down its prey. This time, I thought I heard more than one set. A heavier one, and a lighter one following behind. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn broke, I made a choice. I wasn't gonna sit here waiting. Couldn't. I grabbed the axe I had used for chopping firewood, slung my bag over my shoulder, and headed for the barricade. My plan was simple: clear it fast and get to the car. I didn't care if whoever it was saw me. I just needed out. The barricade wasn't as solid as I had feared. The branches were heavy but loose, piled more for intimidation than real blockage. I dragged them aside, my hands raw, my ears straining for any sound in the trees. Every crack of wood sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Halfway through clearing, I heard it, a snap of a twig just off the trail. I froze, my eyes scanning the treeline. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then I caught it. Movement, the shape of a shoulder, a leg, ducking behind a tree. Someone was watching me. I didn't wait. I shoved the last branch aside, sprinted down the trail, and didn't look back. My bag slammed against my back, the axe still gripped in my hand. The dirt road stretched ahead for I had been needing a break for a while. My work hours had been piling up. The noise of the city felt louder every day, and I had reached the point where the sound of my own phone made me feel sick. A friend of mine once mentioned an old cabin deep in the woods that people could rent for cheap. It wasn't a vacation rental type of place. It was just an old, rough building owned by a family who didn't live there anymore. They let people use it as long as they cleaned up and left a little money under a coffee tin in the kitchen. I decided I needed peace and space more than comfort, so I packed my truck with food, water, a sleeping bag, a lantern, and a few other things I thought I'd need. The drive took most of the day. By the time I got off the main highway, the sun had already started to tilt low. The last stretch was a dirt road that wound into the trees. It was narrow, lined with branches that scraped the sides of the truck. I drove slow, checking every turn against the scribbled map the owner had mailed me. There were no signs, no houses, no people. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, it felt like I had left the world behind. The cabin sat in a small clearing. It was built of dark logs, weathered and gray. The roof sagged a little, the porch leaned forward, and the windows looked like empty eyes. I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment. The woods around me were completely quiet. Not even birds, the kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. I stepped out, stretched, and felt the sudden weight of the stillness pressing on me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was one main room with a small table, a wood stove, and a few shelves stacked with mismatched dishes. In the back was a single bedroom with a bare mattress. The bathroom was an outhouse a few yards from the porch. It was rough, but I hadn't come for luxury. I dropped my bag inside and decided to gather some firewood before it got dark. The woods were thick, the kind where the trees grow so close together the branches tangle above your head. I picked up fallen sticks and broke apart a few rotten logs, then dragged everything back to the porch. The silence followed me everywhere. I kept listening for something, wind, insects, anything, but it was like the whole forest was holding its breath. By the time I had a fire going in the stove, night had already covered the clearing. The first night wasn't too bad. I cooked a can of beans, read by lantern light, and tried to relax. But when I lay down on the mattress, every sound seemed sharp. The creak of the cabin, the faint hiss of the fire, the occasional snap of wood outside. I couldn't tell if those snaps were branches or something stepping on them. I told myself it was just my nerves and finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The second day, I tried to shake it off. I hiked a little deeper into the woods, following what looked like an old deer path. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air felt damp. I kept seeing small things that made me uneasy. Broken branches that looked fresh, a half-burnt log far from any fire pit, what seemed like a pile of old clothes rotting under leaves. I reminded myself that hunters sometimes camp out here, maybe years ago, maybe recently. It wasn't strange for woods to hold leftovers from people passing through. Still, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that the forest wasn't empty. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something small but unsettling. The pile of firewood I had stacked on the porch looked different. Some pieces were shifted, like someone had gone through them. I told myself maybe an animal had crawled around, but the pieces were too big for that. They looked like they had been moved by hands. My chest tightened, but I tried to ignore it. I went inside, shut the door, and kept telling myself I was imagining things. That night was worse. I woke up around midnight to the sound of soft crunching outside, like someone stepping slowly on dry leaves. It circled the cabin, pausing now and then, My mouth went dry. I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps moved toward the porch, then stopped. For what felt like forever, there was no sound at all. Finally, I heard the faint creak of a board, as if weight had been put on the porch. My heart slammed against my ribs. I gripped the flashlight in my hand and waited. Minutes crawled by. Nothing else happened. After an hour of silence, I must have drifted off from exhaustion. In the morning, I stepped outside carefully. The porch boards looked the same. The dirt around the cabin showed no clear tracks, but the ground was so covered in leaves it would have been hard to tell anyway. I walked the clearing slowly, scanning the tree line. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The woods just stood there, heavy and dark, like they were hiding something. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone. If somebody was out here, I wouldn't know until they wanted me to. I decided to stay busy to keep my mind from running wild. I cut more wood, boiled water, and wrote in a notebook I had brought. But the feeling of being watched never left. I'd look up from my work and swear I saw something shift between the trees. Not movement exactly, more like the suggestion of a shape where there hadn't been one before. When I stared, there was nothing, just the same endless woods. By the fourth day, the silence was breaking me. I hadn't seen a single deer, squirrel, or bird. It was unnatural. Even the outhouse felt dangerous. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, like eyes followed me from the shadows. I started keeping the hatchet close even indoors. That night, when I was dozing by the stove, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, slower this time, deliberate. I held my breath and waited. The sound circled the cabin, stopped by the window, then faded into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. By the woodpile was a long, deep scratch carved into the cabin's wall. Not a claw mark, not random, a straight line, dragged hard into the wood, almost waist-high. It hadn't been there before. My stomach turned. Someone had been close enough to touch the cabin while I was inside. I packed my bag right then. I didn't care if it was only morning. I was leaving, but when I turned the key in my truck, the engine only groaned. I tried again and again. Nothing. I opened the hood, checked what I could, but I'm no mechanic. The battery looked fine. Everything looked fine. It just wouldn't start. My hands shook as I slammed the hood shut. I was stuck. The rest of that day was a blur of panic and pacing. I kept the hatchet in my hand and sat by the window, watching the tree line. I thought about walking out, but the dirt road had taken me hours of driving. On foot, with no signal and no clear sense of direction, I'd be walking blind. I decided to stay put until morning. Maybe I could calm down and try the truck again with daylight. That night was the longest of my life. I heard movement almost constantly. Light scraping sounds on the porch, a thump on the roof, soft dragging noises outside the window. Every muscle in my body was wound tight. I sat in the corner with the hatchet, staring at the door, the lantern flickering low. The noises never came all at once, always spread out, just enough to keep me from thinking clearly. Like whoever was out there knew how to keep me awake. By dawn, I was shaking with exhaustion. I forced myself back to the truck and tried again. Still dead. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my backpack. I couldn't stay another night. I stuffed in what food and water I could carry, slung it on, and started down the dirt road on foot. The woods swallowed me fast. The road twisted endlessly, no signs, no markers. Every sound made me spin around. Once, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me, matching mine, but when I stopped, the woods went silent. Hours passed. My legs grew heavy, my throat dry. Still no sign of a highway or a house, just trees stretching forever. By late afternoon, my fear shifted into something worse, certainty. I wasn't lost. I was being followed. At times I caught glimpses, too quick to focus on. A figure between trunks. The flash of movement when I turned my head. Always behind me, never close enough to see clearly. Whoever it was, they knew the woods better than me. They wanted me tired. They wanted me broken. When the sun dropped, I couldn't go any farther. I set my bag down by a fallen log and crouched low. The woods around me grew black, alive with tiny noises. I held the hatchet tight against my chest. I knew I couldn't keep moving in the dark. I'd have to last until morning. That night, I heard them approach. Slow, patient, like they had all the time in the world. A twig snapped, then another. My eyes strained against the dark. The footsteps stopped just out of sight. For hours, nothing but silence. When the first pale light of morning finally crept between the trees, the woods looked empty. No tracks, no figure. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I kept walking, weaker now but determined. By midday, the trees thinned, and I heard the distant I had been planning the trip for months. It was supposed to be simple and quiet, nothing more than a break from my regular life. I had found an old cabin listed for rent in the hills, far from the nearest town, tucked deep inside the woods. The photos made it look plain and rustic, nothing fancy, but it had what I wanted. Isolation, quiet, and a place where I could sit without hearing cars or neighbors. I packed up food, clothes, a couple of knives, a flashlight, matches, and a small camping stove in case the cabin's one didn't work. I also brought a small notebook to keep track of things, though I never expected I'd end up filling it with anything other than small thoughts. The drive took almost 5 hours. The last part of the road turned into rough dirt, twisting up into the hills with thick trees on both sides. The deeper I went, the more cut off I felt. I kept checking the signal on my phone, watching the bars drop until they disappeared completely. By the time I reached the cabin, I was completely alone in every way. The cabin looked older than it had in the photos. The wood siding was darker, weathered by years of storms and sunlight. The windows were small, and the front steps creaked when I walked up. The lock was stiff, but the key turned after a hard twist. Inside, the air was stale, and dust hung in the beams of light coming through the window. It smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but not unbearable. The place had one main room with a small wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a single narrow bed against the far wall. A small door in the corner led into a bathroom with a cracked mirror and a toilet that flushed weakly. I put my things down and walked through the place slowly, trying to get used to it. I noticed little details. The nails in the floor sticking out slightly in places, a faint stain on the ceiling that looked like old water damage, the sound of tree branches brushing the roof when the wind blew. It wasn't unsafe, but it had that feeling of being worn down and forgotten. I told myself that was exactly what I wanted. The first night passed without much trouble. I cooked some canned food on the stove, listened to the forest outside, and lay on the bed while the wood creaked around me. I had trouble sleeping at first, not because of noise, but because of the silence. It was so heavy I could hear every shift of the floor, every branch outside, every little movement I made. I drifted in and out until I finally fell asleep. The next day, I explored around the cabin. The woods were thick, with pine needles covering the ground. There was no clear trail, but I followed the slope of the hill downward for a while. I saw animal tracks, mostly deer, and I found a small stream running clear over rocks. I filled a bottle, filtered it, and drank it cold. The air was cool even though the sun was out, and I felt good about being out there, cut off from everything else. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that I didn't think much about at first. The door latch looked slightly different from how I remembered leaving it. I told myself I might have rushed out and not shut it properly. I closed it again and forgot about it. That evening, while I was sitting at the table, I heard a sound from outside. It was faint, maybe 10 or 20 feet away, like something moving through the brush. I stayed still, listening. It didn't continue, and eventually I shrugged it off as a deer. Out in the woods, there are always animals moving around, and I reminded myself of that. But later, when I went outside to relieve myself before bed, I saw something in the dirt near the cabin. There were shoe prints. They were not mine. They were slightly larger, spaced farther apart, and fresher than the older faded ones I had made earlier. They circled around the side of the cabin and ended near the back window. My chest tightened as I stood over them. I stayed awake longer that night, lying on the bed with my flashlight in my hand. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept listening, waiting for a sound that would confirm someone was out there. But nothing came. Eventually, my body forced me to sleep. The following morning, I decided to walk farther into the woods to clear my head. I tried to convince myself the footprints might have been left by someone before me, maybe days ago, and I just hadn't noticed. But as I walked, I couldn't stop thinking about them. The farther I went, the more I checked over my shoulder. On the way back, I saw something else that unsettled me even more. Near the stream, wedged between two rocks, there was an old shirt. It was dirty, damp, and looked like it had been left there for weeks, maybe longer. But it was in a spot where the water couldn't have carried it naturally. Someone had left it there. Back at the cabin, I went around the whole place slowly. I checked the windows, the corners, and the ground. More shoe prints. Some overlapped with my own, but others were fresh, crisp in the dirt. Whoever it was had been there recently, maybe even while I was gone. That night was worse. I barely moved from the bed, keeping my flashlight and knife within reach. Hours passed. The cabin groaned. The wind shifted through the trees, and I stared at the ceiling. Then I heard it, the slow crunch of footsteps on dry leaves outside. They stopped near the wall. My chest pounded as I held my breath. The steps moved again, circling the cabin. I stayed still, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped near the window, and for a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the window frame creaked, as if a hand had pressed against it. My throat felt dry. I gripped the knife, waiting for the glass to break. But it never did. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded away into the woods. The next morning, I went outside to look. There were more shoe prints, pressed deep in the dirt, circling again. This time, they led off into the trees, farther than I could see. I knew then that someone was watching me, moving around the cabin at night. From that point on, my days changed. I stayed alert, checking the trees constantly, listening for every shift of sound. I barely ate. I set up small strings with empty cans near the windows, hoping they would make noise if touched. At night, I sat awake in the dark, waiting. One night, the cans rattled. I jumped to the window with the flashlight, shining it out. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure moving quickly back into the dark, too fast to make out details. The next day, I found a mark on the cabin door, a deep scratch, long and deliberate, cut into the wood near the handle. It hadn't been there before. I wanted to leave, but the dirt road was long, and my car was parked just out front, vulnerable. If someone was watching, they'd know when I left, and I wasn't sure what they'd do then. I decided to wait for daylight, pack quickly, and leave as early as possible. That night was the longest of all. I barely blinked, watching the shadows. The cans rattled more than once, and I heard breathing outside the wall, soft, steady, like someone standing inches away. At one point, the door handle twitched. It didn't turn all the way, but it moved enough to make me sit frozen with my knife in my hand, sweating and shaking. When the sun finally rose, I moved fast. I shoved everything into my bag, grabbed my keys, and ran to the car. The woods were silent, but I felt eyes on me the whole time. I started the engine and drove down the dirt road, checking the mirror over and over. It wasn't until I reached the paved road miles later that I let myself breathe. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I felt exhausted, like I hadn't slept for days. I never found out who it was or why they were there. I never went back for the deposit I'd left, never contacted the owner, never explained. I just left it behind. Even now, when I think back to it, I can still hear the slow footsteps circling the cabin at night and the faint sound of breathing just outside the wall. I learned that silence in the woods isn't peaceful when you know someone else is moving through it. It's not calm, it's suffocating. And I know that if I had stayed just one more night, if I had ignored my instincts, something worse would have happened. That's the last time I ever stayed alone in a cabin. I had been looking forward to that weekend for months. Life in the city had been wearing me down, and I wanted silence, space, and a place where I could hear my own thoughts without car horns, ringing phones, or the endless hum of people all around me. I booked a small, old cabin up north, tucked away deep in the woods. It wasn't fancy, but that was what I wanted. No neighbors, no traffic, no lights from the houses next door. Just me, a quiet place, and the tall trees swaying in the wind. The drive out there took longer than I thought. I left early on a Friday morning, packed my car with food, a couple of warm blankets, a small propane stove, a cooler, some tools, and a few other things I thought I'd need. My phone's service started dropping out the deeper I drove into the woods, and by the time I was on the last dirt road leading to the cabin, I had no bars at all. It didn't bother me much. Part of me even liked it. It felt like the world couldn't reach me out there, and for once, I could just exist without the noise. The cabin was smaller than I pictured, but solid. Old, dark wood, one window in the front, a tiny porch with 2 steps, and a door that looked like it had been replaced at least once over the years. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the chimney leaned just slightly, but it looked safe enough. Inside, the air was stale, but I expected that. Dust floated in the light that came through the small window. There was a wood stove in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a single bed pushed against the wall, and some shelves with a few mismatched dishes left behind. It was simple, and I liked that. The first day was quiet. I unpacked my food and gear, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and gathered some wood from a pile stacked outside. I sat on the porch for a while and listened to the woods. The silence wasn't empty. I could hear the distant creak of trees in the wind, the crackle of leaves as small animals moved through them, and the occasional caw of a crow. Felt peaceful. That night, I cooked a simple meal on the propane stove, read a book by flashlight until I got tired, and then laid down on the small bed. That first night, I noticed how dark it really was out there. In the city, even at its quietest, there's always light somewhere. Street lamps, passing cars, neon signs. Out there, it was pure black. When I turned off my flashlight, the darkness pressed against my eyes. I couldn't see the walls, the stove, or even my own hand in front of me. It felt heavy, almost alive, but I told myself I would get used to it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of footsteps in dry leaves. My first thought was deer, maybe raccoons. I peeked through the window, but I couldn't see anything. When I stepped out onto the porch, the woods were still. The air was cold. My breath hung in the air, and the ground was covered with frost. I brushed it off as wildlife and went about my day. I spent the morning walking through the trees, exploring. There were no trails, but I marked my way with bits of cloth tied to branches so I wouldn't get lost. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of trunks and branches that all looked the same. After a couple of hours, I turned back and followed my markers until I found the cabin again. It gave me a strange comfort, seeing the little dark shape through the trees. It felt like a small anchor in a massive ocean. That second night, the sound outside came again. Slow, deliberate steps crunching through leaves. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I listened closely, holding my breath, but the steps stopped after a minute. I didn't hear running, just silence again. I told myself it could have been a deer passing by. Still, it was hard to fall back asleep after that. By the third day, I was starting to feel uneasy. I had the sense that the woods weren't as empty as I wanted them to be. When I walked around, I noticed small things that didn't feel right. A tree with bark scraped off, higher than a deer could reach. A cigarette, but in the dirt, old but definitely man-made. A rusted can half-buried near a stump. None of it was alarming by itself, but together, it reminded me I wasn't the first person out here. Someone had been here before, maybe even recently. That night, the steps came back. This time, they didn't fade as quickly. They circled the cabin, slow and steady. My chest tightened as I sat on the bed, flashlight in my hand, staring at the door. The crunching stopped near the porch. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence. I waited, gripping the flashlight until my hand hurt. Eventually, I heard the steps again, moving away, fading into the woods. I barely slept that night. My mind kept going back to the cigarette butt, the old can, the sound of those deliberate steps. Animals don't walk like that. They don't circle cabins and linger by doors. That was a person. The fourth day, I kept close to the cabin. I collected more firewood, checked the area around the clearing, and tried to stay busy. I found faint boot prints in the dirt near the trees, partly covered by fallen leaves. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier. I followed them a little way into the woods before turning back. My chest felt tight, and the silence of the trees pressed against me. That night, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and kept my flashlight and hatchet next to the bed. I lay there, staring into the dark, waiting. The steps came again like I knew they would. Slow, patient, circling. They stopped by the window this time. I couldn't see out, but I could feel it, the weight of someone standing there, listening. My skin crawled. My hand shook as I gripped the hatchet tighter. Minutes passed before the steps moved away again, fading into the black woods. By the fifth day, I was done pretending it was nothing. Someone was out there. I didn't know why, but they knew I was here. Maybe they lived in the woods, maybe they were just wandering. But the way they circled, the way they lingered, it wasn't random. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road was long, and if my car broke down, I'd be stuck in the middle of nowhere. Still, staying felt worse. I spent the day packing up my gear, loading my car, and making sure everything was ready to go. But part of me wanted answers. I wanted to know who was out there. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. I tried to get through one more night. That night, I didn't lie down. I sat at the table, flashlight off, hatchet close, trying to listen through the silence. My eyes burned from exhaustion. The steps came again, just like before. Slow, patient, circling. This time, they didn't stop at the window or the porch. They came to the door. The handle rattled. The sound sent a chill through me that I'll never forget. Someone was testing it, checking if it was locked. My chest pounded so hard I thought I'd pass out. The chair under the handle held, and after a moment, the rattling stopped. Silence stretched, long and unbearable. Then the steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. When the gray light of morning finally came, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't bother making breakfast or cleaning up. I just threw my bag into the car, turned the key, and drove. My eyes scanned the trees the whole way down the dirt road, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. But the woods stayed still. When I finally reached the main road and my phone buzzed back to life, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't look back at the woods. I just drove until the cabin was miles behind me. That was the last time I ever rented a place like that. It wasn't the silence that got to me or the dark. It was knowing that someone else had been out there, moving through the trees, circling in the night, trying the door. They never came in, but they could have. They knew I was there. And the worst part was knowing they're probably still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next cabin to go dark. I had always liked the idea of being alone for a while, away from people, away from the constant sound of cars, phones, and everything else that seemed to grind into my head every day. That's why, when a coworker mentioned his uncle owned an old hunting cabin deep in the woods and hardly ever used it anymore, I jumped at the chance. It was late summer, the days were still warm, the nights just beginning to cool, and I thought a week of peace by myself might help clear my head. The cabin wasn't anything special, at least not in the way most people would imagine. It wasn't some polished log home with modern comforts. It was small, square, with faded wood siding, a tin roof, and a porch that sloped a little on one side. He said it hadn't been used much in years, maybe once or twice a season, but it was still standing, still dry inside, and still had a working wood stove for when nights grew cold. That was enough for me. I loaded up my truck with what I thought I'd need. A cooler of food, a few gallons of water, a sleeping bag, a lantern, matches, a knife, a small hatchet, and some extra clothes. I wasn't going there to live rough like some survivalist, but I knew better than to rely on luck. The cabin, he warned, was about 6 miles off the nearest dirt road, and the track leading to it wasn't something I could drive. That meant parking, hiking in, and carrying everything on my back in a pack that seemed much heavier than it had when I packed it. The hike itself took me the better part of 2 hours. The trail wasn't well marked, but he had given me a rough hand-drawn map with landmarks to watch for. A big split boulder, a tree that forked like a slingshot, a low stream that cut across the path. By the time I reached the clearing and saw the cabin sitting at the edge of the trees, sweat was running down my back, and my shoulders ached from the straps digging in. The first thing I noticed about the place was how quiet it was. Not just quiet in the normal sense of being away from town, but dead still. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just the occasional wind moving through the trees and the faint clicking of insects. The clearing itself was maybe 40 yards across, ringed by tall pines and a few oaks. The cabin sat just inside the tree line on the far side, its roof dark with age, its windows dull and dusty. Inside, it was about as simple as a place could get. One main room with a cot against the wall, a wood stove with a pile of split logs next to it, a table with 2 chairs, and some shelves holding a few old pans and cups. Dust coated everything, and when I stepped inside, the floor groaned like it hadn't been walked on in months. Still, it was shelter, and that was all I really wanted. The first evening, I set up my things, rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot, unpacked the food into a crate, checked the lantern, and swept some of the dust and cobwebs away. It felt strange at first, like I was squatting in someone else's forgotten place. But by the time the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the clearing, it started to feel more like mine. I cooked a simple meal of beans and bread on the stove, listened to the fire crackle, and then sat on the porch until the stars came out. It was darker than I expected. In town, even out in the suburbs, there's always some glow from streetlights or passing cars. Out there, it was black. The kind of black where your eyes strain to pull shapes out of the dark but find nothing. The only thing I could hear were the insects and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deep in the trees. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come quickly. Every sound seemed louder in that cabin. The creak of the wood, the faint scratching of something outside, the groan of the roof cooling in the night air. I told myself it was just the woods settling, animals moving, nothing unusual. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I woke to light streaming through the cracks in the shutters. My back was stiff from the cot, but the air smelled fresh, damp with dew. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to explore around the cabin. There wasn't much, just trees in every direction. The clearing was thick with grass and weeds, a few old stumps, and the faint trace of what had once been a trail leading deeper into the woods. I didn't go far that day. I was tired from the hike and just wanted to relax. I spent most of it chopping a bit of wood, reading a book I had brought, and walking short loops around the clearing. The silence was starting to feel normal, though every now and then I caught myself listening too closely, as if expecting something. It was that night when things started to feel different. I was lying on the cot, lantern off, just the faint red glow of the stove burning down, when I heard something outside. At first, it was just a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another, slow, spaced out, deliberate. My chest tightened. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe a raccoon nosing around. But the steps didn't wander. They circled. I could hear them moving along the edge of the clearing, one at a time with long pauses between. I sat up in the dark, straining to hear. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it filled the room. The steps would stop, and then, just when I thought it was my imagination, they would start again on the other side. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, gripping the handle of the hatchet, staring at the black window. Finally, they faded away. No rush, no crash through the underbrush. Just silence until even the insects seemed to come back. The next morning, I told myself it had to have been an animal. Maybe a bear, though the steps hadn't sounded heavy enough. Maybe someone had wandered close, but that didn't make much sense. The cabin was miles from anything. Who would come all the way out here in the middle of the night? I tried to brush it off, but the unease stuck with me. I carried the hatchet with me as I walked the clearing that day, looking for prints. I didn't see much. The ground was covered in pine needles and leaves, hard to make out anything clear. A few spots looked disturbed, like something had pressed down, but nothing I could identify. That night, it happened again. This time I stayed awake, lantern still lit, listening. The steps came later, After midnight, slow and steady, circling again. I felt trapped, like the thin wooden walls were nothing, like whoever or whatever was out there could step through them if they wanted. I gripped the hatchet and forced myself to breathe quietly. My throat was dry, my mouth like cotton. They stayed longer this time. I heard them pause near the porch. The boards creaked faintly, like weight shifting. I held my breath until my chest ached, praying the door wouldn't open. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the sounds drifted off into the trees. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves raw. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of hiking out 6 miles alone, knowing something or someone might still be in the woods, made me stay. The cabin, thin as it was, at least felt like shelter. The days blurred after that. I hardly went far from the cabin. I split wood, kept the stove going, tried to keep busy. At night, I barely slept. The sounds always came, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Sometimes I swore I heard breathing just outside the window. On the 5th night, I made up my mind to leave at first light. I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were shot, and I knew if I stayed another night, I might lose it completely. That night, the steps came again. Slower than ever, closer than ever. I sat there in the dark, clutching the hatchet, watching the faint outline of the door. I heard the creak of the porch, then another creak, closer to the door. I was frozen, every muscle locked. The door never opened, but something pressed against it. The wood groaned softly, like a hand was testing it. Then silence. Long, endless silence. When the morning finally came, I shoved everything into my pack, barely stopping to eat. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just wanted out. The hike back felt 3 times as long. Every crack of a branch behind me made me spin. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone following. I didn't stop, not once, until I reached the truck. When I slammed the door and turned the key, I sat there for a long time, staring into the trees, half expecting to see someone step out. Nothing moved. I drove away and never looked back. For weeks after, I thought about it. I tried to explain it away. An animal, the wind, my own mind. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. Those weren't the steps of an animal. They were too steady, too deliberate. Someone had been out there night after night, circling, watching, waiting, and I'll never know why. I always thought of cabins in the woods as quiet places, escapes from the noise of everyday life. When I rented one for a long weekend, I didn't expect anything strange to happen. The idea was simple. Drive up, stay 3 nights, hike a little, read, and just rest. The place I found was about 4 hours north of my home, tucked deep in a forest that had very few people around. The listing made it look welcoming. It showed a small wooden cabin with a porch, a single chimney, and trees crowding around it in every direction. There was a lake a mile away, trails nearby, and the nearest small town was almost 40 minutes down a winding road. That was exactly what I wanted: quiet, isolation, no interruptions. The drive up was long, and by the time I reached the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun had already begun sliding lower behind the trees. I remember the crunch of gravel under my tires, the dust rising in my mirrors, and the way the forest seemed to close in around me as I drove deeper. The road was narrow, just wide enough for 1 car, and uneven in places. Every so often I would see the tire marks of trucks or SUVs that had gone before me, pressed into the soft ground at the edges. The forest here was thick with tall pines and scattered birches, their trunks pale in the dimming light. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the photos. A small place, 1 floor, dark wood siding, a simple porch with 2 steps leading up. The windows were dusty but intact, and the roof looked solid enough. It sat in a small clearing with grass growing unevenly around it. Behind it, the trees stretched on endlessly, no visible trails or paths breaking through. I parked beside it and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat in the car, listening. The forest was quiet, but not silent. There was the occasional bird call, the faint rustle of leaves, and the distant creak of branches. No cars, no people, no hum of electricity. Just the deep, constant hush of wilderness. I grabbed my bag, walked up the short steps, and unlocked the door with the key that had been left in a lockbox. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of wood and dust strong. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen area on one side, a table with 2 chairs, and a sitting area with a couch and a wood stove. There was one small bedroom and a bathroom with an old shower and sink. It was simple, functional, and quiet. The windows looked out directly into the forest. I unpacked slowly, set my things in the bedroom, and then stepped back outside to take in the place. By now the sun was setting, and long shadows stretched across the clearing. The forest edge seemed darker than it should have been, as if the trees swallowed the light quicker than the open sky. I stood on the porch for a while, arms crossed, just listening again. I wasn't used to that kind of quiet. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the couch with a book, and eventually went to bed. But I noticed how dark it got. Away from the towns and highways, there were no lights at all. The windows turned black, reflecting the inside of the cabin like mirrors. I kept the curtains closed after realizing how uncomfortable it felt to look into that darkness and imagine someone, or something, out there. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight streamed in through the cracks in the curtains, and the air inside was cool. I stepped outside and felt the dampness of morning dew under my shoes. Birds called from the trees, and I could hear the faint trickle of water somewhere in the distance, probably a stream feeding the nearby lake. I decided to go for a walk, nothing long, just to see the area around the cabin. There were no clear trails directly from the clearing, so I pushed into the trees. The forest floor was uneven, covered in fallen branches, moss, and damp leaves. It was harder to walk than I expected. After a while, I found what looked like a faint game trail, narrow and winding, just enough space where animals might have moved through often. I followed it for a while, weaving deeper. The trees blocked most of the sky, making it feel dim even though it was still morning. After maybe 20 minutes, I stopped and turned around. The cabin was nowhere in sight. For a brief moment, I felt disoriented, but I retraced my steps carefully and found my way back. The rest of the day I spent reading, cooking, and sitting on the porch. I noticed the silence again, the kind of silence that almost hums in your ears. Every small sound stood out: the crack of a twig, the flutter of wings, the shift of the wind. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that was just how the wilderness felt. That night, things changed. I went to bed around 10. The forest outside was pitch black, and I made sure to close every curtain. Lying in bed, I listened to the creaks of the cabin, the faint whistle of wind against the roof. I drifted off slowly, but sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The room was dark, the air still. Then I heard it, a sound outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A crunch, like a footstep on gravel or dry leaves. My heart beat faster. I held still, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. Then nothing. I lay there for what felt like forever, straining to hear. Every small noise of the cabin seemed magnified. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer or raccoon. The forest was full of them. Eventually, after maybe an hour of listening and not hearing anything else, I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside. The grass around the cabin was damp with dew again, and I scanned the ground without really knowing what I was looking for. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, near the side of the cabin, I noticed something. The grass was bent, pressed down in a way that looked fresh, almost like a footprint. Not clear enough to see detail, but enough to make my stomach twist. I tried to shake it off. Animals could leave marks like that too. I made breakfast, tried to read, tried to relax. But all day I couldn't stop thinking about the sound. That night I was more on edge. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept a flashlight beside my bed. I lay awake longer, listening to the forest. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just like before, I woke in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was louder, more deliberate, a definite crunch of footsteps in the clearing. Slow, steady, circling. My mouth went dry. I didn't move, didn't breathe loudly, just lay there with my heart hammering. The steps stopped. Then I heard another sound, soft but unmistakable. The creak of the porch step. Someone or something was right outside the cabin. I stayed frozen, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. Minutes passed. I didn't hear the door try to open, didn't hear glass break, just silence. Then, slowly, the steps moved again, away this time, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside again, scanning the ground. This time I found it, clear footprints in the dirt near the porch. Human footprints. At that moment, the isolation of the cabin no longer felt peaceful, felt dangerous. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. Life in the city had been grinding me down, day after day, until I felt like a shell moving through traffic, offices, and crowded sidewalks. My job left me drained. My apartment, though comfortable, was never quiet. Sirens at night, footsteps above me, arguments bleeding through thin walls. It was never still. I wanted silence. I wanted open air. So I booked a week alone at a small rental cabin tucked deep into the woods of northern Montana. The photos online had shown a simple wooden cabin with a porch, surrounded by pine trees so tall they seemed to swallow the sky. The listing promised solitude, wildlife, and pure silence. Sounded perfect. When I arrived, I parked my car on a dirt driveway that crunched under the tires. The cabin sat back from the road, almost hidden. It wasn't big, just a square log structure with a pitched roof, a single chimney, and a front porch with a wooden swing. The paint was old and faded, the kind of gray wood that told you it had been there for decades. It looked weather-beaten, but sturdy. Behind it, the forest stretched as far as I could see, thick with tall pines and underbrush that looked almost black in the shade. I unloaded my bags and carried them inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust, with a faint trace of the last fire that had burned in the stone fireplace. The furniture was simple. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch with fabric that had seen better days, and a bed in the small bedroom with thick blankets folded neatly at the foot. The windows were small, some with thin curtains, some bare. It was quiet in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. No humming appliances, no cars, no voices. Just the sound of the wind in the trees outside. For the first day, I relaxed. I made simple meals, read a book, and sat on the porch with a mug of coffee while the sun dipped behind the trees. By the time darkness fell, the woods turned pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face unless there's a fire or a lantern. I lit a few candles and sat listening to the crackle of the fire I'd built in the fireplace. I felt safe, but that comfort didn't last. On the second night, something woke me. I couldn't tell what at first. I opened my eyes in the dark and listened. The cabin was silent, but outside, I thought I heard something moving. Not the soft rustle of wind in branches, not the distant hoot of an owl. This was heavier, a deliberate crunch of something stepping on dried needles or leaves. My heart thumped in my chest as I held my breath and strained to hear more. The sound stopped. Then, after a long silence, it came again. Closer. Slow, steady, like someone taking careful steps just beyond the wall. I told myself it could be an animal. Deer, maybe, or a bear. The woods were full of them, but the weight in those steps felt different. They sounded too steady. I lay there in the dark for what felt like hours, barely moving, until finally exhaustion won and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. I made coffee, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. But as I glanced at the ground, I froze. Just beyond the porch steps in the dirt were footprints. Human footprints. They were faint in some places but clear in others, leading around the side of the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I crouched to look closer. They weren't mine. These prints were larger, wider, with a deeper heel. Someone had been here, circling the cabin while I slept inside. A chill went through me, but I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe it was a hiker who got turned around and passed by. Maybe it was the owner checking the place without mentioning it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That day, I stayed near the cabin, nervous to wander far into the trees. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every creak of wood and every snap of a branch outside pulled my attention. I cooked dinner early, ate quickly, and locked the door as the light faded. I pushed a chair under the doorknob even though it already had a bolt. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the bed with my ears straining. For hours, I heard nothing but the occasional call of a bird or the wind brushing against the cabin walls. Then, deep into the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, circling like the night before. This time I was sure it wasn't my imagination. They stopped and started, sometimes fading as if the person or thing moved farther away, then returning closer. I sat up in bed, clutching the blanket, staring at the dark window. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass across it, blotting out faint moonlight for just a second. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally came, I felt sick with exhaustion. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the trees. More footprints, fresh ones, in the damp earth from overnight. Whoever it was had come right up to the back wall of the cabin this time, close to the bedroom window. Panic set in. I thought about leaving, packing my things, and driving back to town. But the idea of stepping into those woods with someone out there, hiding and watching, made me hesitate. What if they were still nearby? What if they followed? Instead, I stayed another day, telling myself I would leave the next morning in daylight. I tried to keep busy. I gathered wood, double-checked the locks, and kept a kitchen knife within reach. I even stacked some furniture against the back door, just in case. But as the sun went down, my fear grew worse. The third night was different. The footsteps didn't circle. They came straight toward the cabin and stopped. I heard the boards of the porch creak under weight. My body went cold. Someone was standing just outside the front door. I held my breath, frozen, listening. Minutes passed. Then I heard the faint sound of the doorknob turning, testing. It rattled softly, slow, deliberate. The lock held. Then silence again. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the knife so tight my hand ached. When daylight came, I opened the door cautiously. On the porch, in the thin layer of dust and pine needles, were clear boot prints. They led up to the door, stopped there, then turned and vanished into the forest. That was enough. I couldn't stay. I threw my things into my bags, heart racing, and hauled them to the car. The whole time, I scanned the trees, half expecting someone to step out. I unlocked the car and tossed everything inside. The engine started with a roar, louder than I'd ever been glad to hear. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see someone stepping out onto the road behind me. But the trees stayed empty. It wasn't until I reached the main highway, miles away, that I finally let myself breathe. I didn't report it. I don't know why. Maybe because nothing happened beyond footsteps and fear. Maybe because I didn't want to try to explain to someone who might think I was exaggerating or imagining things. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching me in that cabin night after night, circling in the dark, testing the locks, waiting. And the worst part is knowing that if I had stayed just one more night, I don't think the lock would have been enough. I had been wanting to get away from everything for a while. Work had become a constant loop of noise and pressure, and even when I was home, I never really felt like I had peace. My phone never stopped buzzing, and even when it was quiet, my mind kept racing. A friend of mine told me about an old cabin he knew of that sat back off a forgotten logging road deep in the woods. He said no one went there anymore, and it wasn't one of those places you could find listed online. The land technically belonged to some family he knew, but they never used it. He said if I wanted a real break, if I wanted to be alone, I should take a weekend there. I jumped at the chance. The thought of being far away from everything felt like the only thing that could reset me. No cell signal, no noise, just me, a cabin, and the woods. That was all I wanted. I packed simple things. Food I could cook on a stove or fire, a small cooler of water, some dry clothes, a flashlight, batteries, and a folding knife. I left early on a Friday morning in late October, when the air was crisp but not yet bitter, and the trees were shedding their leaves across the dirt back roads. The drive took me nearly 4 hours. By the time I left paved roads behind, my car crunched over gravel, and soon even that gave way to a track of dirt marked with old tire ruts. It was the kind of road you could barely notice unless you were looking for it. Branches scraped the sides of my car as I crept forward, deeper and deeper into the woods. It felt like I was driving straight into the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where if my car broke down, no tow truck would ever find me. That feeling was both terrifying and thrilling. Eventually, the trees opened slightly, and I saw the cabin. It wasn't much, just a squat wooden structure with a metal roof that had gone dull with age. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, and one of the railings leaned off to the side as if it had been hit years ago and never fixed. A pile of old firewood sat under a tarp beside the porch. The windows were small and dusty, and the place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I parked close, stepped out, and felt that stillness right away. It was the kind of silence you only notice far from towns, where the only sound is wind through the trees and the occasional caw of a crow. Even my footsteps on the porch sounded louder than they should. The door opened with a long creak when I pushed it, and inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen against the wall, a wood stove, and a table with 2 chairs. There was a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom with a cracked mirror. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. I set my bag on the table, opened the shutters on the small windows to let in light, and stood there for a while just listening. No cars, no voices, no humming of power lines, only silence. That first day was peaceful. I walked around the area to get familiar with it. Behind the cabin, the woods grew dense. The trees pressed close together, their trunks thick and their branches heavy with dead leaves. There was a faint trail that led off to the left, but it looked overgrown and hadn't been walked in years. I followed it for a short distance, crunching through leaves, but stopped when I realized I didn't have a map and didn't want to get lost. I turned back, but the feeling of being watched tugged at me in a strange way. I told myself it was just nerves, the city still lingering in my body, making me paranoid about every shadow. By evening, I had the stove going and heated a can of soup. The sun dipped fast behind the trees, and before I knew it, the woods outside were completely black. I lit a lantern, set it on the table, and ate in silence. The only sound was the crackle of wood and the occasional ping of the metal roof cooling in the night air. When I lay down in the small bed, the silence pressed on me harder than I expected. I thought it would be soothing, but it felt heavy. Every creak of the cabin sounded like something moving. Every snap outside sounded like a footstep. I had to remind myself over and over that I was alone, that animals moved through the woods all the time, that I was safe. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I felt better. I stepped outside with a mug of instant coffee and breathed the cold air. It was sharper now, and a thin mist clung to the ground between the trees. I thought about going for a longer walk, maybe exploring that old trail more. I packed a small backpack with water and a snack and set out. The trail wound deeper than I expected. Fallen logs forced me to climb over or go around. At times, it disappeared completely under the blanket of leaves, and I had to scan the ground to pick it up again. After about an hour, I found something odd. The trail opened into a small clearing, and in the middle of it was what looked like the rusted remains of an old hunting stand, collapsed against a tree. Nearby, there were broken beer bottles, a torn piece of tarp, and the remains of a small fire pit. It looked like someone had been there not too long ago. That unsettled me. My friend told me the cabin was unused, that no one ever came out here. But clearly, someone had been nearby. I looked around, half expecting to see fresh footprints, but the leaves covered everything. Still, the thought nagged me as I turned back. When I reached the cabin again, I noticed something small but strange. The firewood pile that sat under the tarp looked different. When I arrived, the tarp had been pulled tightly over it. Now it sagged, as if it had been lifted and dropped again. I crouched down, tugged the tarp back, and saw the pile underneath shifted. Maybe an animal had gotten in. Raccoons or squirrels, maybe. I pulled it back in place and tried not to think too much about it. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. The sounds outside seemed closer. A steady crunch of leaves, slow and measured, like something circling the cabin. I held my breath in the dark, staring at the faint shape of the window. I told myself it was deer. They moved through the woods all the time, but the steps didn't sound like a deer. They sounded deliberate, with pauses between them, like someone was taking careful steps. I lay awake until the sounds faded. When I finally drifted off, it was with unease twisting my stomach. The following day, I decided to cut my trip short. Something about the cabin no longer felt right. I packed slowly, trying not to admit to myself that I was scared. As I carried my bag to the car, I noticed something that froze me. Near the tree line, the leaves were disturbed in a wide pattern, as if someone had been standing there watching the cabin. I backed toward my car, heart hammering, and tossed my bag inside. When I went to the driver's side, I saw something etched into the layer of dirt on the window. A line drawn with a finger, just a single vertical line. That was it. I jumped in, started the car, and drove down the old road as fast as I could without wrecking. My eyes kept flicking to the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. By the time I reached the highway, my hands were still shaking. I didn't stop until I was nearly home. I never told my friend what I saw. I never asked him about who might go out there. And I know I'll never go back. The cabin gave me what I thought I wanted. Silence, solitude, a break from everything. But in that silence, I found something else. The woods may look empty, the roads forgotten, but someone is always out there, and sometimes they're closer than you realize. I had been looking forward to that week for months. The plan was simple. I wanted peace, quiet, and time away from people. I had rented a small cabin deep in the northern woods, far from towns and far from the noise of my normal life. I picked that cabin because it was remote, surrounded by pine trees and miles of forest. There were no neighbors close by. The nearest road was a rough dirt trail that stretched for almost an hour before meeting the highway. The rental company told me it was rustic, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and limited electricity from a small generator. That was what I wanted, a break from everything. The drive out was long, and the closer I got, the more alone I felt. The paved road narrowed into gravel, and then the gravel turned to a dirt path. The forest grew denser on each side. My car bounced along the uneven track, branches scraping against the doors, the suspension groaning with each dip and rut. After miles of slow driving, the cabin appeared between the trees. It sat on a small clearing, its wood dark with age, its roof lined with pine needles. A short porch stretched across the front, and a single set of wooden steps led up to the door. Behind it, the forest stretched endlessly, a green wall of silence. When I parked and stepped out, the stillness struck me. There were no human sounds, no traffic, no hum of life. Just the whisper of wind moving through the treetops and the distant call of birds. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected. A single main room held a small table, 2 chairs, a couch, and a wood stove for heat. Against one wall was a kitchenette with an old propane stove and a pump sink that drew water from a hand-dug well. A short hallway led to a bedroom with a simple bed and a dresser. The bathroom was basic with a composting toilet. It wasn't luxury, but it was more than enough for me. I had brought plenty of food, water, and a few books. My plan was to spend my days hiking and my nights reading or writing in a notebook I had carried along. That first afternoon was calm. I unpacked, carried my bags inside, and stacked the supplies neatly in the small kitchen. I opened the windows to let the fresh air in, and for hours I just sat on the porch, listening to the quiet. The sun sank slowly through the trees, and when darkness came, it came fast. There were no streetlights here, no glow from nearby houses. The woods swallowed the light completely. I lit a lantern, ate a simple dinner, and sat by the stove while the fire popped and cracked. When I went to bed, the silence felt almost heavy. I was used to distant traffic or the hum of electronics at home. Here, the dark had weight, and every small sound in the woods carried through the thin cabin walls. The next morning, I woke early. Light streamed through the small window, and I felt rested. I made coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and packed a small backpack with water and snacks. I wanted to explore the forest trails that branched out from the clearing. According to the map, there were several old logging paths that wound deep into the woods. I followed one of them for hours, the sun cutting thin shafts of light through the tall pines. The air was cool, and the forest floor was soft with needles. I saw deer tracks, heard woodpeckers hammering at trees, and felt completely alone. It was what I wanted. But even on that first hike, I noticed something that made me uneasy. The forest had an unusual stillness. Birds called, yes, but there were stretches where everything seemed to stop. The silence would fall suddenly, heavy and complete, as if the woods were holding their breath. Each time it happened, I stopped and listened, my skin prickling. I told myself it was just normal. Forests have rhythms, and sometimes animals grow quiet. But I couldn't shake the way it made me feel. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the shadows stretched long across the clearing. I lit the lantern again, cooked a small meal, and settled into the same routine. Night fell, and the woods grew darker than before. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard something faint outside, a crunch like a foot on dry needles. I sat up, heart thudding, and listened. The sound stopped. The forest was still. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe. I lay back down, but it was a long time before I fell asleep. The next few days passed slowly. I hiked different trails, gathered firewood, and wrote in my notebook. But each night, the unease grew stronger. The sounds outside the cabin became harder to ignore. Sometimes it was the faint crack of a branch. Sometimes it was a shuffle in the underbrush. One night I swore I heard the creak of the porch steps. I sat upright in bed, staring at the door, my chest tight. Minutes stretched on, and eventually the sound faded. I told myself again it was an animal, but the thought of deer climbing my porch didn't make sense. Raccoons, maybe. Still, my mind circled the possibilities, and sleep became difficult. By the fourth night, I was exhausted. I sat on the couch with the lantern burning low, listening for sounds I didn't want to hear. The fire in the stove had burned down, and the cabin was cold. At some point, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. A sharp noise woke me, a thud against the wall. My eyes snapped open, my breath caught. I sat still, every muscle rigid, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, like something brushing against the outside wall of the bedroom. I stood slowly, crept toward the window, and pulled the curtain back just an inch. The clearing lay empty. The pale light of the moon washed over the trees. The porch was still, but the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. I let the curtain fall, stepped back, and forced myself to breathe. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. The days after that blurred together. My hikes became shorter. I felt less safe venturing far from the cabin. I started noticing small details I had missed before. On the edge of the clearing, I found footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human. The prints were faint, but they circled near the tree line, leading nowhere. I told myself maybe a hunter had passed through, but the prints looked fresh, pressed deep into the soft ground. Another day, I noticed something strange near the well. A piece of wood, broken and splintered, lying on the ground as if someone had struck it hard against the pump handle. I didn't remember it being there before. At night, the sounds grew worse. The crunch of footsteps moved around the cabin. I heard them circling, pausing, then starting again. Once, I thought I heard the faint sound of breathing, just outside the thin wooden wall. I didn't move. I lay frozen in bed, eyes open wide, waiting. The sound lasted only seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the mattress. By the sixth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed awake with the lantern burning, my flashlight in one hand, a heavy fire poker in the other. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Sometime after midnight, I heard the porch steps again. Slow, deliberate creaks, one after another. My stomach twisted. I gripped the poker tighter. The steps stopped right outside the door. For long minutes, nothing moved. Then came a sound I will never forget. The slow, careful turn of the doorknob. It rattled softly at first, then harder. The door shuddered, but the lock held. I sat frozen, every nerve on fire. Finally, the rattling stopped. Silence pressed in again. Whoever was out there didn't leave right away. I felt them standing there, just on the other side, waiting. Only after what felt like an eternity did the porch steps creak again, moving slowly back into the dark. When dawn finally came, I packed. I didn't care that my rental time wasn't finished. I shoved clothes into my bag, stuffed food into plastic bins, and hauled everything out to the car. My hands shook as I loaded the trunk. The forest felt too quiet, as if holding its breath, watching. I turned the car around and drove as fast as the rough dirt track allowed, glancing in the rearview mirror again and again. The cabin shrank behind the trees until it was gone. It took nearly an hour to reach the main road. When I finally saw the stretch of asphalt ahead, my shoulders sagged with relief. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. Only then did I let myself breathe properly. I sat in a gas station parking lot, staring at the steering wheel, shaking. I never reported it. I never told the rental company what happened. I just left the key in the drop box and drove home. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep without lights on. Every creak of my house made me flinch. Even now, years later, the memory of that doorknob turning in the silence still makes my chest tighten. I wanted peace and quiet, but what I found in that cabin was something else entirely. Something I never want to feel again. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. I wanted a break from everything. Work had been crushing me. The noise of the city was getting too much, and I felt like I hadn't breathed real, fresh air in months. When I found a small listing online for a secluded rental cabin deep in the woods, it felt like the perfect answer. The pictures showed a little wooden cabin with a porch, tucked between tall pines, with no neighbors for miles. That kind of quiet was exactly what I needed. The drive out there was long. I left early in the morning to avoid traffic, and by the time I was off the main highway, it felt like I was already in another world. The paved road narrowed into 2 lanes, then eventually broke into gravel and dirt. Trees thickened on both sides, blocking most of the sky. My GPS signal went out more than once, and I kept second-guessing if I had missed a turn. I passed only one gas station in the last hour, and after that, nothing but woods and the occasional broken fence. By the time I reached the property, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because I had found it at last, unease because of just how far removed it was from anything else. The dirt driveway stretched a few hundred feet into the trees before opening into a small clearing. The cabin stood in the center, dark with siding weathered from years of storms, a thin chimney poking up from the roof. There was a small woodshed off to the side, a pile of logs neatly stacked under a tarp. I parked in the clearing and shut off the engine. The silence hit me hard. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no buzz of electricity like in the city. Just the faint rustle of wind in the trees and a bird calling far off. It was calming at first, almost peaceful, but there was also something heavy about it, like the quiet was pressing in on me. The cabin itself was simple inside. A single room with a kitchenette, a small dining table, and a couch. A short hallway led to a bathroom and a bedroom with one window looking out toward the woods. It smelled of old wood and faintly of dampness, but it wasn't unpleasant. There was no cell signal inside, and the cabin didn't have Wi-Fi, which I expected. That was part of the charm, I reminded myself. A chance to disconnect. The first day passed without much. I unpacked, stacked some firewood inside, and walked a short distance down a path behind the cabin. It led to a small creek, the water moving slowly over rocks. I sat there for a while, listening to it, feeling like I was finally away from the constant rush of life. I cooked myself a simple meal back at the cabin and turned in early. That first night, I woke up once to the sound of something outside. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like slow, deliberate steps moving across the porch. I froze in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. I didn't hear any knocking, no sound of the door handle, just those steps and then silence. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a deer had wandered close. Still, I found it hard to sleep again after that. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the porch. The wood was old, and dust clung to the boards, but I could see faint scuff marks near the steps. They weren't clear enough to be footprints, but something had definitely been there. I didn't think too much about it, though. Being in the woods meant animals everywhere. I shrugged it off. During the day, I kept myself busy. I took a longer hike past the creek, followed a game trail through the trees, and even found an old hunting stand nailed to a tree. The woods were dense, and I noticed quickly how easy it would be to lose your bearings. Without the sun visible through the trees, everything looked the same. I kept careful track of my path and turned back before it got too late. That night, the sound came again. This time, it was clearer. The creak of a board, the scrape of weight shifting across the porch. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and strained my ears. The steps moved slowly from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. I wanted to convince myself it was still an animal, but the pacing, the rhythm, it sounded too heavy and deliberate. I stayed in bed, too nervous to move, until eventually the sounds faded. The next morning, I checked again. More faint marks on the porch, this time near the edge. I crouched down and looked closer. They almost looked like boot scuffs, but the wood was too worn to be certain. My stomach sank. If it really was a person, what were they doing out here at night? There were no other cabins nearby, no neighbors for miles. I spent the day uneasy, constantly glancing at the treeline. The woods that had felt so calm yesterday now felt different, like eyes were on me. I went back to the creek but didn't linger. I made sure the cabin door was locked early that evening and stacked a chair against it for good measure. When night fell, I kept the lights low, hoping maybe whoever or whatever was coming wouldn't notice. Hours dragged by. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The slow creak of the porch. This time, I forced myself out of bed and moved quietly to the living room. I kept the lights off and crouched near the window, peeking through a gap in the curtain. First, I saw nothing. The porch was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the moon through the trees. Then movement, something shifted near the far corner. My chest tightened. A shape, tall, broad-shouldered, moving slowly along the edge of the porch. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. I ducked away from the window, pulse pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I stayed crouched there, barely breathing, listening to him move back and forth. He never knocked, never tried the door, just walked slowly, sometimes pausing, sometimes scraping his boots against the boards. After what felt like forever, the steps finally retreated. Silence returned. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sight of those scuffed marks on the porch made my stomach churn. Whoever he was, he had been right there, feet from the door, watching. I thought about leaving that morning, packing my things and driving back to town. But part of me reasoned maybe it was just some hiker who had gotten lost. Maybe he was passing through. The rental listing had said nothing about trespassers, but it was an old cabin. Maybe the land wasn't as private as I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of how deliberate those movements had been. That day dragged. Couldn't relax. Every sound outside made me jump. A squirrel darting across the roof, branches snapping in the woods. It all set me on edge. I kept the blinds shut and stayed mostly inside, trying to read, trying to distract myself, but my mind kept circling back to the man. Who was he? Why was he there? Why didn't he knock, or say anything, or even leave a note? Night came again, and with it, the dread. I didn't bother lying down. I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring at the door. Hours passed. The silence was so heavy I almost wished for noise, just so I'd know what was coming. Then, as if on cue, the porch creaked. This time, the steps were quicker, back and forth like he was pacing. Then the handle of the door rattled. My blood turned to ice. The chair I had wedged against it shifted slightly, but the door held. He didn't try to force it, but the sound of that handle turning sent a wave of panic through me. I grabbed the fire poker from near the stove and held it tight, my hands shaking. I stood there, staring at the door, listening. The handle rattled once more, then silence. Minutes dragged by. Finally, the steps moved off the porch and faded into the trees. That was it for me. At first light, I packed everything into my car as fast as I could. I didn't care about leaving food behind, didn't care if I left the place messy. I just wanted out. The drive back felt endless. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone following me. When I finally reached a main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I never went back for the rest of the rental period. I called the rental company later and told them there had been someone prowling around at night. They didn't seem surprised. Said sometimes drifters pass through, and I should have called the sheriff if I felt unsafe. It's been months now, but I still think about it. The way he moved, the way he never said anything, never made himself known, just circled the cabin like he was waiting. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But I know one thing, I won't ever stay in a cabin that remote again.